Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. After a long day at work, I was looking forward to the comfort of my home. The familiar routine of unwinding in my living room, enjoying a hot meal, and catching up on some much-needed relaxation was all that was on my mind. The drive back was uneventful, and the neighborhood looked serene under the dim evening light. I pulled into the driveway, noting the peaceful quiet that seemed to envelop the street. Little did I know that the tranquility was about to be shattered. As I approached the front door, I noticed something was off. The first hint was the absence of the soft glow of lights from within. My house was dark, an unusual sight given that I usually left a few lights on to deter any potential intruders. I fumbled with my keys, a creeping sense of unease settling over me. The neighborhood was quiet, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately struck by a sense of disarray that was impossible to ignore. The entryway was cluttered with overturned shoes and discarded mail. The normally neat hallway was strewn with objects, a lamp was knocked askew, and the rug was askew, revealing a corner of hardwood floor that should have been covered. The quiet was unsettling, the kind that feels too loud in its stillness. My heart began to race as I moved through the house, calling out to see if anyone was there. The silence was my only answer. The living room was a scene of chaos. Cushions were thrown across the room, and the coffee table was upended, its contents scattered. My first instinct was to check for any obvious signs of forced entry, but the door and windows were all intact, locked as they should be. I made my way into the kitchen, where the disarray was even more pronounced. Cabinet doors hung open, and kitchen utensils were strewn about. The once tidy countertops were cluttered with items that had been pulled from drawers and left in a disorderly heap. The refrigerator door was ajar, its contents barely disturbed. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the violation of my personal space was palpable. My anxiety grew with each step as I proceeded through the house. I moved into the hallway, where the bedrooms were located. The sight that greeted me was even more disturbing. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I was met with the sight of drawers pulled out and their contents rifled through. Clothes were strewn across the floor, and the bed was disheveled, as if someone had searched for something or someone in a hurry. The dresser was a mess of open drawers and scattered personal items. I noticed that some of my jewelry was missing, including a few pieces that had sentimental value. The sense of violation was profound, each missing item a stark reminder of the intrusion into my private life. I moved to the other bedrooms, finding the same disturbing scene. The guest room, normally a haven for visitors, was now a reflection of the chaos that had overtaken the house. Items from the closet were scattered around, and the bed was a mess of tangled sheets. Even the study, where I kept important documents and personal papers, had been ransacked. Papers were strewn about, and my filing cabinet was left open, its contents in disarray. There were no signs of violence or aggression, no broken windows, no damaged doors. It seemed as if the intruder had been careful not to cause unnecessary damage, but the impact of their presence was nonetheless deeply unsettling. The lights being off only added to the eerie atmosphere, and the lack of forced entry made it clear that the intruder had likely been familiar with the house or had somehow managed to gain access without breaking anything. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. The police needed to be called, and I had to ensure that the situation was reported properly. As I made the call, I felt a deep sense of vulnerability. The intrusion was not just about the physical disruption, but also about the breach of trust and security that came with it. While waiting for the police to arrive, I walked through the house, trying to piece together what had happened. My mind raced with questions. Who could have done this? What were they looking for? Why had they targeted my home? The more I thought about it, the more anxious I became. The sense of being watched or targeted, combined with the personal violation of my space, left me feeling exposed and unsettled. When the police arrived, they conducted a thorough investigation. They took notes, collected evidence, and assured me they would look into any leads. They explained that sometimes burglaries like this one involved individuals who knew the victim or had been in the home before. The lack of forced entry and the meticulous nature of the search suggested that the intruder had some knowledge of the house and its layout. The officers did their best to provide reassurance, but their presence did little to ease the lingering discomfort. I was left to process the aftermath of the invasion, dealing with the emotional impact and the practicalities of repairing the damage. As they left, they promised to follow up with updates and urged me to be vigilant and secure my home. In the following days, I took steps to reinforce the security of my home. I installed new locks, set up security cameras, and ensured that all lights were operational. The process of restoring order to my home was slow and disheartening, but I focused on regaining a sense of normalcy. Despite these efforts, the sense of violation remained. Each missing item and each disheveled room was a reminder of the intrusion into my private life. The intrusion had left a deep mark, and the memory of that unsettling return lingered. The incident became a stark reminder of how fragile our sense of security can be and how deeply an invasion of personal space can affect us. Story 2. It started with an innocuous email, one of those routine notifications we often dismiss without a second thought. "Your order has been confirmed," it read, accompanied by a list of items I had never purchased. Confusion mingled with a tinge of annoyance as I clicked through to investigate further. Little did I know, this was the beginning of a nightmare that would engulf my life for months to come. The customer service representative on the other end of the line seemed helpful at first, until I mentioned the items in question were not mine. "Can you confirm your address and social security number?" they asked politely. Alarm bells began to ring in my head. Why would they need such sensitive information just to cancel an order? With caution, I declined to provide more details and insisted they look into the matter without further input from me. That evening, the first strange phone call arrived. A man's voice, filled with anger and accusation, demanded to know why I had stolen his identity. Bewildered, I tried to explain that there must have been a mistake, but he wouldn't listen. Threats of legal action and retribution echoed through the receiver before he abruptly hung up. The following days blurred into a relentless barrage of similar calls and emails. Each communication carried a sense of urgency and hostility, as if I was personally responsible for ruining someone else's life. Despite my attempts to clarify, the accusations grew more vehement. Some callers claimed I owed them money, while others accused me of crimes I had never committed. Panic set in as I realized the extent of the identity theft I was embroiled in. Desperate for guidance, I contacted the authorities. Filing a police report felt like a feeble gesture in the face of this digital onslaught. The officer I spoke with sympathized but cautioned that resolving identity theft cases could be a lengthy and arduous process. In the meantime, I was advised to monitor my accounts closely and refrain from engaging with unknown parties. Days turned into weeks, and the harassment only intensified. Personal information that I had considered private appeared online, seemingly confirming my involvement in fraudulent activities. Friends and colleagues started to ask uncomfortable questions, unsure whether to believe my protests of innocence. The once familiar routine of daily life became suffocating under the weight of suspicion and fear. Sleepless nights were spent scouring the internet for clues or signs of the real perpetrator. I learned about phishing scams, data breaches, and the dark web, places where stolen identities were bought and sold like commodities. It was a chilling realization that my personal details could be circulating in these shadowy corners of the internet, exploited by faceless criminals beyond my reach. Professional help offered little solace. Identity theft recovery services promised resolution but required hefty fees I couldn't afford. Legal consultations hinted at long and costly litigation processes with no guarantee of vindication. Each option seemed like a daunting uphill battle against an unseen adversary who held all the cards. Despite the overwhelming odds, a glimmer of hope emerged from an unexpected source. The cybersecurity expert I consulted through a friend offered to investigate pro bono. His expertise uncovered a trail of digital breadcrumbs leading back to a sophisticated network of fraudsters operating overseas. They had hijacked not just my identity, but those of countless others in a meticulously orchestrated scheme. Armed with this newfound evidence, I approached the authorities once more. This time, armed with concrete proof, they launched a coordinated effort with international law enforcement agencies. Raids were conducted, arrests made, and slowly but surely, the web of deception began to unravel. Months after that initial email, I received a call that finally brought relief. The main orchestrator of the identity theft operation had been apprehended. His confession implicated several others involved in the syndicate, including those responsible for framing innocent victims like myself. It was a bittersweet victory, tempered by the realization of how close I had come to losing everything I had worked for. Rebuilding trust and reclaiming my identity proved to be an ongoing challenge. Credit scores needed repairing. Relationships required mending, and scars of suspicion took time to fade. Yet through the ordeal, I gained a newfound appreciation for resilience and the importance of vigilance in an increasingly interconnected world. Today, I remain vigilant about cybersecurity measures and advocate for greater awareness of identity theft risks. My story serves as a cautionary tale for anyone who might underestimate the impact of digital vulnerabilities. While the scars of those harrowing months may never fully heal, they have shaped me into a stronger, more aware individual who refuses to let fear define my future. Story 3. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I had just returned from my routine jog and was enjoying a cup of coffee at my kitchen table when the mail arrived. Among the usual bills and junk mail was a plain envelope with no return address. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it, only to find a photograph of myself standing in my front yard. The image was clear, and the date and time on the back of the photo were recent. I felt a chill run down my spine. The picture was taken from a distance, but it was unmistakably me, standing right where I had been just a few days ago. I brushed it off as a prank or a misunderstanding, but the unease remained. I decided to keep the photograph and not mention it to anyone just yet. Over the next few days, the unsettling pattern continued. Each morning another envelope would arrive, and each one contained a photograph of me, taken from various angles and locations around my house. Sometimes it was me sitting on the porch, other times it was me leaving for work. The pictures were always taken from outside, from a vantage point that suggested someone was watching me. The constant stream of images was unnerving. I found myself looking over my shoulder, constantly aware of every shadow and sound. I began to question whether someone was surveilling me, or if there was a more sinister motive behind the photographs. Each new envelope seemed to intensify my fear and paranoia. I decided to take action. The first thing I did was contact the police. They took my report seriously, but their initial investigation yielded little information. They advised me to keep the photographs and any evidence of the surveillance. In the meantime, they increased patrols around my area and suggested I take precautions to ensure my safety. Determined to get to the bottom of the situation, I enlisted the help of a private investigator, Jenna. She was experienced in cases involving harassment and stalking and had a reputation for thoroughness. Jenna arrived at my home and I showed her the collection of photographs I had received. "This is definitely a cause for concern," Jenna said, examining the photos closely. "These images are taken from different angles and distances, which suggests the person is familiar with your daily routine and knows where to position themselves for the best vantage points." Jenna conducted a thorough investigation around my property. She checked for any signs of tampering or hidden cameras and inspected the perimeter for any potential entry points. She also interviewed neighbors and reviewed local security footage to see if there were any clues about who might be responsible. As days turned into weeks, the frequency of the photographs increased. Each new batch was more intrusive than the last, showing me in increasingly private moments. I found myself constantly adjusting my routine, closing curtains, and being overly cautious about my movements. The sense of being watched was pervasive and unsettling. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard a knock on the door. I hesitated but decided to answer it. To my surprise, it was Jenna. She looked grim, and her expression conveyed that she had important news. "I've made some progress," she said. "I've reviewed the security footage from your neighborhood and found something suspicious. There's a vehicle that's been parked near your house several times, always around the time you received the photographs." Jenna provided me with the details of the vehicle, its make, model, and license plate. I felt a surge of hope mixed with anxiety. The idea of tracking down the person responsible seemed like a step toward regaining control of the situation. With this new information, the police were able to identify the vehicle's owner. To my shock, it turned out to be someone I knew, a former colleague named Mark, who had always seemed a bit off. Mark had been terminated from his job for inappropriate behavior, and it seemed he had a grudge against me. The police arrested Mark and conducted a search of his property. They found additional equipment used for surveillance, as well as a stash of photographs similar to the ones I had received. It became clear that Mark had been using his knowledge of my routine to stalk and intimidate me. When Mark was brought in for questioning, he admitted to the surveillance but claimed he was just trying to send a message and that he never intended to actually harm me. The police assured me that his actions were taken seriously and that he would face legal consequences for his behavior. Although Mark's arrest brought a sense of closure, the emotional impact of the experience lingered. I had been living in a state of constant fear and vigilance for weeks, and it took time to rebuild my sense of safety and normalcy. I continued to work with Jenna and the police to ensure that all traces of Mark's surveillance were removed and that my home was secure. In the aftermath of the ordeal, I took steps to enhance my home security and became more aware of my surroundings. I also sought support from a therapist to help process the trauma and regain a sense of normalcy. The experience had been harrowing, but it also reinforced the importance of vigilance and taking action when something feels wrong. The photographs had been a stark reminder of how easily our personal space can be invaded, and the lengths to which some individuals might go to exert control or intimidation. While the fear and anxiety remained, I found solace in the knowledge that I had taken the necessary steps to protect myself and reclaim my sense of security. Story 4. The house had always been quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that wrapped around you like a cozy blanket. It was a peaceable silence, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant hum of traffic. But as the days passed and I settled into my new home, I began to notice a shift in the house's atmosphere. The silence started subtly. One evening, as I was reading in the living room, I realized how profoundly quiet the house had become. The usual sounds, the distant chatter of neighbors, the occasional bark of a dog, the rustling of leaves outside had faded away. At first, I attributed it to the time of year. It was autumn, and the leaves had begun to fall, muffling the usual sounds of the neighborhood. But as the weeks progressed, the silence became more pronounced. It wasn't just a lack of external noise, it was a profound, almost oppressive quiet that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. The absence of sound was so intense that it felt tangible, a heavy blanket that pressed down on me, making the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. The first time I noticed it was on a chilly October evening. I was sitting in the kitchen, enjoying a cup of tea. The house was in complete darkness, save for the soft glow of the kitchen light. As I sipped my tea, I realized that I could hear nothing, not the usual hum of the refrigerator or the soft rustle of leaves against the window. Even the distant sounds of the city, which had been a constant background presence, were gone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a quiet night, or perhaps the insulation of the house was particularly effective. I reminded myself that it was simply the way things were now. I even attempted to listen for any faint sounds, but there was nothing, just the eerie, overwhelming silence that seemed to stretch out endlessly. As the days turned into weeks, the silence grew more oppressive. I began to notice how the quiet affected my sense of reality. It felt as though the house had been removed from the world, isolated in a bubble of silence. I would lie in bed at night, unable to sleep, the stillness pressing in from all sides. The absence of sound made the silence feel almost alive, as though it were a physical entity that watched and waited. On particularly quiet nights, the house seemed to take on a different character. Shadows danced on the walls, and the silence became a canvas for my imagination. Every creak, every rustle of the house settling seemed magnified in the absence of any other noise. My mind, left to its own devices, began to conjure unsettling scenarios. The silence became a breeding ground for my fears, amplifying every minor noise into something sinister. I started to feel isolated, not just physically but emotionally. The silence made it difficult to gauge the passage of time. Days blurred together, and the lack of external stimuli made me feel disconnected from the world outside. It was as if the house had become a timeless void, a place where the normal rhythms of life had ceased to exist. One night, driven by an increasing sense of unease, I decided to investigate the source of the silence. I wandered through the house, checking every room, every corner, hoping to find something that would break the spell of quiet. I opened windows and doors, hoping to let in some sound from outside, but the silence remained unbroken. Even the usual sounds of the neighborhood seemed to have been swallowed by the stillness. As I moved through the house, I felt a growing sense of dread. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and the oppressive silence was like a physical weight. It was as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something that I couldn't quite understand. The silence became so profound that it felt like it was closing in on me, making it difficult to think clearly or stay calm. In my desperation, I sought out distractions. I played music loudly, hoping to fill the house with sound, but even the music seemed to be swallowed by the silence. I invited friends over, trying to break the isolation with conversation and laughter, but even their voices seemed to be absorbed by the oppressive quiet. It was as though the house had a way of dampening every attempt to reintroduce normalcy. The sense of being alone became overwhelming. I felt as though I were the only person in a vast, empty space, disconnected from the world outside. The silence became a constant companion, a reminder of the house's strange and unsettling nature. I began to question my sanity, wondering if the silence was a figment of my imagination or if there was something more sinister at play. The oppressive silence began to affect my sleep patterns. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling of being watched or listened to by an unseen presence. The silence made every noise feel amplified, every shadow more menacing. I became increasingly anxious, my sense of reality slipping as the quiet grew more intense. One evening, as I sat in the living room, staring at the flickering light of the fireplace, I made a decision. I could no longer ignore the impact that the silence was having on me. I decided to seek help, reaching out to a therapist to discuss my growing sense of unease and isolation. The therapist helped me explore the psychological impact of the silence and the ways in which it had affected my perception of reality. Together, we worked on strategies to cope with the sense of isolation and to reintroduce a sense of normalcy into my life. Gradually, I began to reclaim my space, finding ways to break through the oppressive quiet and reconnect with the outside world. Although the silence of the house never fully dissipated, I learned to manage my response to it. I became more mindful of my surroundings and found ways to create a more balanced environment. The house remained quiet, but I no longer felt overwhelmed by it. The silence, while still present, had lost its power to dominate my thoughts and emotions. In the end, the house's silence became a part of my experience, a reminder of the delicate balance between solitude and isolation. It taught me the importance of facing one's fears and finding ways to reconnect with the world, even when it feels as though everything is closing in. The oppressive quiet of the house was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity for growth and self-discovery. Story 5. It was a typical Monday evening when I received the voicemail that would haunt me for weeks. I had just settled into my cozy armchair, wrapped in a soft blanket, and was preparing to unwind with a book after a long day at work. The soft glow of the lamp and the distant hum of traffic outside provided a sense of normalcy, a respite from the relentless pace of daily life. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my reverie. I glanced at the screen and saw a missed call from an unknown number, followed by a voicemail. I wasn't expecting any calls, so I hesitated for a moment before deciding to listen to the message. As I tapped on the voicemail icon, a wave of apprehension washed over me, though I couldn't quite place why. The voicemail began with a cold, mechanical voice, devoid of emotion. The voice was distorted, as though it were coming through an old speaker, making it difficult to pinpoint its origin. But the clarity of the message was unmistakable. "Hello," the voice began. "I see you've been busy lately. Just wanted to remind you that I'm watching. I know where you were last night, and I know exactly what you were doing. The cafe on Main Street, the same one you visited every Tuesday. I saw you meet your friend there. I saw the way you looked at him and the way he looked back. You're not as careful as you think." My heart pounded in my chest. How did this person know about my routine, my meetings with friends? The details in the message were disturbingly accurate. I had, indeed, gone to the cafe on Main Street the previous evening to meet an old friend. The mention of the cafe and the details of our interaction felt like an invasion of my privacy. The voicemail continued, the tone becoming more sinister. "I also noticed you've been working late at the office. I know the hours you keep and the routes you take home. You think you're safe, but you're not. I'm always watching, always close by. It's only a matter of time before I come for you." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The voice was chilling, and the implications were terrifying. The thought of someone tracking my movements, knowing my daily habits, and threatening me with vague, but menacing promises was enough to send shivers down my spine. I replayed the voicemail several times, trying to make sense of it, but each replay only heightened my anxiety. I immediately called the police, my hands shaking as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. Officer Reynolds was assigned to my case and arrived at my home within an hour. He listened attentively as I played the voicemail for him, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. Officer Reynolds took notes and assured me that the police would investigate. He advised me to be extra cautious, to document any unusual activity, and to report any further threats immediately. He also suggested that I change my daily routines and be mindful of my surroundings. The next few days were marked by a heightened sense of paranoia. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, double-checking my locks, and avoiding any predictable patterns in my movements. I took different routes to and from work, changed my routine visits, and even considered altering my phone number. Despite these precautions, the sense of vulnerability remained. Every knock on the door, every unexpected phone call, and every unfamiliar face in the vicinity caused my anxiety to spike. I felt as though I was living in a constant state of alert, with the shadow of the unknown threat looming over me. As the investigation continued, Officer Reynolds kept me updated with any developments. They traced the call to a prepaid phone, which provided no useful information about the caller's identity. The voice distortion on the voicemail made it nearly impossible to identify the perpetrator, and the police struggled to find any concrete leads. Days turned into weeks, and the haunting voicemail remained a dark cloud over my life. The sense of invasion and fear was constant, and the lack of resolution only exacerbated the anxiety. I avoided sharing the details with friends and family, not wanting to burden them with my fears or make them worry. One evening, as I was reviewing security camera footage from my home, I noticed something unsettling. A shadowy figure had been lingering near my front yard during the time when I had received the voicemail. The figure appeared to be watching the house, occasionally glancing towards the windows before disappearing into the darkness. I shared the footage with Officer Reynolds, who took the sighting seriously. The police increased their patrols in the area and continued to investigate any potential connections to the threat. However, the figure's face was obscured, and the footage provided little new information. In an attempt to regain a sense of normalcy, I took further security measures. I upgraded my home security system, including installing motion sensors and additional cameras around the property. I also sought counseling to help manage the stress and anxiety caused by the threats and the constant sense of being watched. Months passed, and the fear gradually lessened, though the experience had left a lasting impact. The case remained unsolved, and the voicemail's origin was never traced. The police continued their efforts, but the investigation provided no definitive answers. In the end, the incident served as a stark reminder of the unpredictability of personal safety and the importance of vigilance. While the immediate threat was never fully resolved, I found comfort in the steps I had taken to protect myself and in the support of those around me. The experience had taught me to be cautious and aware, but it also reinforced the resilience that I had discovered within myself. Story 6. It was an ordinary Friday afternoon when the unsettling incident occurred. I had just returned home from work, eager to unwind after a long week. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pall over the neighborhood, and a light drizzle fell intermittently, adding a sense of dreariness to the day. I pulled into the driveway, relieved to be home, and noticed a car parked across the street, facing my house. At first glance, it seemed like any other vehicle, nothing particularly striking about it. It was an older model sedan, a muted blue color that had seen better days. The car's windows were fogged up slightly from the rain, and no one was visible inside. I didn't think much of it as I went inside, assuming it was just a neighbor's car or a visitor who had left momentarily. However, as the afternoon wore on, the car remained in its spot. I noticed it out of the corner of my eye while doing household chores, and it became increasingly apparent that it was not just parked there but seemed to be observing my house. I tried to dismiss my growing unease as paranoia, but the car's stationary presence began to gnaw at me. As the hours passed, the car remained parked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to a sense of dread that had been creeping up on me lately. I decided to take a closer look. I went to the window and carefully peered out, hoping to catch any hint of activity or an explanation for the car's prolonged presence. From my vantage point, I could see the car's license plate through the rain-speckled window. I took a mental note of the plate number and decided to investigate further. As I dialed the local police non-emergency line, my mind raced with questions. Why was this car sitting there? Who did it belong to? Could it be a coincidence, or was there something more sinister at play? The dispatcher on the other end of the line took down the details, including the license plate number and a description of the vehicle. She assured me that an officer would be dispatched to check on the situation. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a bit of relief, but also growing more anxious as the minutes ticked by. In the meantime, I kept an eye on the car from the window, trying to gauge any signs of movement or activity. The rain had intensified, drumming against the roof and adding to the sense of isolation. The car remained eerily still, as though its occupants were waiting for something or simply observing in silence. When the police arrived, I went outside to meet them and explain the situation. They approached the car and began their investigation. I watched from the porch, my heart pounding as the officers examined the vehicle and its surroundings. They took down the license plate number and checked the registration details. After a few moments of discussion, one of the officers came over to speak with me. The officer informed me that the car was registered to a name I didn't recognize, and there were no outstanding warrants or known issues associated with it. The registration details matched the car, but beyond that there were no immediate concerns from a legal standpoint. The officer noted that while the car's presence was unusual, it was not necessarily illegal to park and observe from a public space. The officers took a brief look around the area for any additional evidence or signs of suspicious activity, but found nothing unusual. They advised me to stay alert and report any further incidents or concerns. I thanked them for their assistance, though their words did little to ease my growing apprehension. After the police left, I decided to take additional precautions. I made sure all the doors and windows were securely locked and set up the security cameras around the perimeter of the house to capture any unusual activity. I felt a need to be extra vigilant, as the lingering sense of being watched was unsettling. That evening, I tried to go about my routine as normally as possible, but the presence of the car and the subsequent police visit had left me feeling on edge. The rain continued to fall, and the rhythmic patter against the windows seemed to accentuate the quiet of the house. I checked the security camera feeds periodically, looking for any signs of unusual activity or the return of the mysterious vehicle. As the night wore on, the car eventually disappeared. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of it returning, but the street remained empty. Despite the car's departure, the experience had left a lasting impression. The sense of unease lingered, and the image of that stationary vehicle parked outside my home, seemingly watching and waiting, was imprinted in my mind. The following days passed with an increased sense of vigilance. I continued to monitor the security cameras closely and made sure to remain aware of any changes in my surroundings. The incident had heightened my awareness of the possibility of being watched and had instilled a deep-seated wariness. While the authorities had found no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, the mysterious car and its unnerving presence remained a haunting memory. It served as a stark reminder of how quickly our sense of safety can be disrupted by the unknown and the unsettling feeling of having one's privacy invaded by an unseen observer. The experience left me with a lasting sense of vulnerability, an awareness of the fragility of personal security, and a heightened vigilance that would stay with me for a long time. Story 7. The morning started off like any other, with the promise of a productive day ahead. I had a busy schedule, with meetings, errands, and appointments planned. I decided to start the day with a trip to the gym before heading to the office. The sun was shining, and everything seemed perfect. Little did I know, this day would become one of the most unsettling of my life. As I approached my car in the gym parking lot, I noticed something was off. The driver's side door, which I had locked securely the night before, was slightly ajar. My heart sank as I reached for the handle and saw that the interior light was on. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I quickly scanned the area, but the parking lot was eerily empty, with only a few cars scattered around. I opened the door and stepped inside, my fears confirmed. The car had been broken into. The glove compartment was wide open. The contents of my center console were scattered on the floor, and the small storage areas had been rifled through. I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I looked for any signs of what had been taken. It was then that I noticed a folded note on the driver's seat. My hands shook as I picked it up, the ominous feeling of dread intensifying. I unfolded the note and read its chilling contents. "Good morning. I hope you're feeling refreshed after your workout. I saw you leave your house early today, just like you always do on Wednesdays. It's impressive how consistent you are with your schedule. I noticed you like to stop at that coffee shop on the corner before work, and I've seen you there several times. It's a good place to catch a quick break. Don't worry about your car. I didn't take anything important. And just a small reminder that you're always being watched. Keep up the good work. Maybe next time you'll see me around. Or maybe you'll just hear from me. Stay vigilant." The note was deeply unsettling. It contained detailed information about my daily routine, including my morning workouts and my habitual coffee shop visits. The precision of the observations made my skin crawl. The thought that someone had been watching me, tracking my movements, and now had the audacity to break into my car was terrifying. I immediately called the police, reporting the break-in and the threatening note. An officer arrived at the scene within a short time, taking statements and examining the vehicle for fingerprints or other evidence. They reassured me that they would investigate, but cautioned that finding the culprit might be challenging due to the lack of concrete evidence. The officer asked about any recent conflicts or suspicious activities, but I couldn't think of anything specific. My life had been relatively uneventful, and I couldn't identify anyone who might have a motive for targeting me. The intrusion seemed random but terrifyingly personal. After the police completed their investigation, I was left alone with my thoughts. The sense of violation and fear was overwhelming. The note had not only invaded my personal space, but had also intruded into my private life. I felt exposed and vulnerable, unable to shake the image of someone watching me from the shadows. I took immediate steps to enhance my security. I installed a new alarm system in my car, added additional locks to my doors, and began using a steering wheel lock for extra security. I also started parking in well-lit, heavily trafficked areas whenever possible. The added measures helped, but the sense of unease lingered. The police investigation continued, but the case remained unsolved. The note had been written on plain paper with no identifiable markers, and the fingerprints collected from the card did not match any known individuals. Despite their efforts, the authorities were unable to make any progress. The experience took a significant emotional toll. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly checking for any signs of someone following me or watching my movements. I found it difficult to relax, even in my own home, and I began to avoid places I frequented regularly out of fear of running into the person who had targeted me. In an attempt to regain some control, I sought the help of a therapist to work through my anxiety and fear. Therapy provided a space to process my emotions and develop coping strategies. I learned techniques for managing my anxiety and began practicing mindfulness to help reduce my overall stress levels. As time went on, the fear gradually began to subside, though the experience left a lasting impression. The intrusion had shattered my sense of security and trust, making me more cautious and vigilant. I became more mindful of my personal safety and more proactive in safeguarding my privacy. The incident served as a harsh reminder of the vulnerabilities we face in an increasingly connected world. It highlighted the importance of being aware of our surroundings and taking proactive measures to protect ourselves. Although the experience was deeply unsettling, it also strengthened my resolve to advocate for better personal security and to remain vigilant in the face of potential threats. While the identity of the person responsible for the break-in and the threatening note remained a mystery, I eventually learned to live with a heightened sense of awareness. I continued to take steps to protect myself and my belongings, and I found solace in knowing that I had taken proactive measures to enhance my security. The ordeal had left its mark, but it had also reinforced my commitment to safeguarding my personal safety and maintaining a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Story 8. It was a bright Monday morning when I found myself sifting through a stack of resumes for an open position at my company. As the HR manager, I had seen my fair share of job applications, some impressive, others forgettable. But one resume caught my eye for all the wrong reasons. The name at the top was Joshua Kane, a nondescript name that belied the chilling details that followed. His work experience was sparse, his education mediocre. But it was the gaps in his employment history that raised red flags months at a time with no explanation provided. Curiosity piqued, I decided to dig deeper. A quick online search revealed a series of unsettling news articles linked to a Joshua Kane in a neighboring town. Allegations of harassment, confrontations with law enforcement, and even a restraining order filed against him by a former colleague all painted a troubling picture. As HR protocol dictated, I scheduled an interview with Joshua Kane, hoping to gauge his character firsthand. When he arrived at our office, a tall, imposing figure with piercing eyes and an air of restrained intensity, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. The interview began like any other, with polite introductions and standard questions about his qualifications and career goals. Joshua Kane spoke confidently, his answers carefully crafted to present himself in the best possible light. But beneath the surface, I sensed a simmering volatility, a darkness that lurked just out of sight. I pressed him on the gaps in his resume, the unexplained absences that hinted at a troubled past. Joshua Kane grew visibly uncomfortable, his jaw tightening as he struggled to provide coherent explanations. He skirted around the questions, deflecting with vague excuses and thinly veiled hostility. Despite my reservations, I continued the interview, hoping to glean more information that might shed light on his character. But as the minutes ticked by, my unease only grew. There was something about Joshua Kane, an unsettling presence that seemed to hang in the air like a storm on the horizon. At one point, I asked about his previous work experience, at a local retail store, a job he had held for less than 6 months before abruptly leaving. His response was cryptic, filled with veiled references to disagreements with management and misunderstandings with coworkers. "I prefer not to dwell on the past," he said curtly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm focused on the future, on finding a place where I can make a real difference." His words sent a chill down my spine. There was an underlying menace in his tone, a thinly veiled threat that made me fear for the safety of my colleagues. I glanced at the door, half expecting security to burst in and escort him out. But I couldn't dismiss him based solely on intuition. HR policies required a thorough vetting process, including background checks and reference calls. Reluctantly, I concluded the interview, thanking Joshua Kane for his time and promising to be in touch soon. As he left the office, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but that relief was short-lived. Over the coming days, I delved deeper into Joshua Kane's background, uncovering a trail of disturbing incidents and questionable behavior. Police reports hinted at a pattern of aggression and volatility, a troubling history that had somehow eluded detection until now. I consulted with my colleagues and superiors, voicing my concerns about Joshua Kane's potential threat to our workplace. The consensus was unanimous: his background posed too great a risk to ignore. But without concrete evidence of criminal activity, our hands were tied. Meanwhile, Joshua Kane continued to email and call, pressing for an update on his application. Each message sent a shiver down my spine, a reminder of the looming threat he represented. His persistence bordered on harassment, further solidifying my resolve to keep him at arm's length. Then, one afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I spotted Joshua Kane waiting by my car. His presence sent a jolt of fear through me, and I hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. But before I could react, he approached with an unsettling smile. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," he said casually, his voice dripping with false charm. "I just wanted to follow up on my application. Any news?" His proximity made my skin crawl, and I instinctively took a step back. "I'm sorry, but I'm not able to discuss this right now," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rising panic. Undeterred, Joshua Kane leaned in closer, his eyes boring into mine with unnerving intensity. "You know, I'm really passionate about this opportunity," he said softly. "I'll do whatever it takes to prove myself." His words sent a chill down my spine. It was clear he wasn't going to take no for an answer. I glanced around, hoping to catch the attention of a passing coworker or security guard, but the parking lot was eerily empty. "I think you should leave," I said firmly, taking a decisive step towards my car. "Now." For a moment, Joshua Kane seemed taken aback by my assertiveness. But then, with a cold smile, he nodded and backed away. "Of course," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of menace. "I'll be waiting to hear from you." As I drove away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, I knew the encounter with Joshua Kane was far from over. His dark and unsettling background had cast a shadow over our workplace, leaving me fearful for the safety of my colleagues, and determined to prevent him from ever setting foot in our office again. Story 9. One night, my phone rang at 2 a.m., tearing me from a deep sleep. The shrill sound of the ringtone cut through the quiet of my bedroom, and I fumbled groggily to answer it. With a bleary-eyed swipe, I brought the phone to my ear, my mind struggling to make sense of the situation. The room was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the blinds, and the house was otherwise silent. "Hello?" I said, my voice thick with sleep. There was no response, just a faint, unsettling silence on the other end. I tried to listen for any sounds, but the line was eerily quiet. I sighed, thinking it was likely a wrong number or a telemarketer. and was about to hang up when I heard a soft, chilling whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm outside." The words were barely audible, a breathy murmur that seemed to seep through the phone and into the stillness of the room. My heart skipped a beat. I strained to hear any further sounds, but the line remained silent. Adrenaline surged through me, pushing aside the remnants of sleep as I sat upright in bed, my mind racing. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table and with trembling hands made my way to the window. The curtains were drawn and the room was cloaked in shadow. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and slowly pulled back the curtain to peer outside. The moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the driveway in the front yard. My eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement or presence. At first I saw nothing but the usual quiet landscape, my parked car, the neatly trimmed lawn, and the darkened street. But then I noticed it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the driveway, partially obscured by the darkness. The figure was tall and indistinct, a mere silhouette against the night. It stood perfectly still, facing the house. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make out any details, but the figure remained shrouded in shadow. I couldn't discern any features or clothing, only the unsettling impression of someone or something waiting outside my home. Panic surged through me. I backed away from the window, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I quickly considered my options. Should I call the police or investigate further? The fear of confronting an unknown figure in the dead of night clashed with the need to ensure my safety. I decided to call 911, hoping that having the authorities aware of the situation would be the safest course of action. As I dialed, my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I spoke to the dispatcher, explaining the situation in as calm a manner as I could manage. They assured me that an officer would be dispatched to my address immediately. I ended the call and moved quietly through the house, making sure all doors and windows were securely locked. The minutes seemed to stretch endlessly as I waited for the police to arrive. The fear of the unknown figure lurking outside gnawed at me, and every creak of the house or gust of wind felt magnified. I occasionally peeked through the window, but the shadowy figure remained in place, its presence an unnerving constant. After what felt like an eternity, I finally heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. Relief mixed with anxiety as I saw the flashing lights of the police vehicles illuminating the street. I hurried to the door to let the officers in, eager for them to investigate the situation. 2 officers entered the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I explained the situation, recounting the phone call and the sighting of the figure in the driveway. They listened attentively and then proceeded to the front door to assess the situation. I watched anxiously from the doorway as they approached the driveway, their flashlights sweeping over the area. The shadowy figure was no longer visible, and the driveway appeared empty. The officers conducted a thorough search of the surrounding area, checking for any signs of disturbance or evidence of someone being there. After their inspection, the officers returned to the house, their expressions unreadable. They informed me that they had not found anyone in the vicinity, and there were no signs of forced entry or unusual activity. They suggested that it might have been a prank or a case of mistaken identity, but they assured me they would keep an eye on the area and advised me to report any further suspicious activity. As they left, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease. The shadowy figure had vanished, but the experience had left a mark on me. The unsettling whisper on the phone and the sight of the figure standing outside my home were haunting reminders of the fragility of safety and the unpredictability of the unknown. In the days that followed, I tried to shake off the fear and return to normalcy. I installed additional security measures around the house and made sure to be vigilant. The incident remained a chilling memory, a reminder of how quickly a peaceful night could be shattered by the intrusion of something unknown and unsettling. The shadowy figure had left no trace, but its presence had cast a long, dark shadow over my sense of security. Story 10. The morning began like any other. I awoke to the soft hum of my alarm clock and went through my usual routine. I had recently installed a new home security system to enhance the safety of my property, and it had been functioning flawlessly. As I prepared for work, I noticed a small, unsettling detail. The security system panel was unusually quiet. No beeps, no blinking lights, just silence. I chalked it up to a minor glitch and went about my day. It wasn't until later that evening, when I returned home, that the full extent of the problem revealed itself. As I approached the front door, I noticed that the lock seemed slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I was certain I had locked it properly before leaving. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. I glanced around, expecting to see signs of forced entry, but everything appeared normal at first glance. The security system panel remained inactive, which set off a new wave of anxiety. I tried to reset the system, but it refused to reboot. That's when the realization struck me. The system had been disabled. I immediately contacted the security company's support line. The technician who answered confirmed my worst fears. They had no record of any disconnection or tampering from their end. This was a serious breach. The technician advised me to check the entire house for any signs of tampering or unauthorized access. Following their advice, I conducted a thorough search of the property. Everything seemed in place until I reached the basement. There, in the dim light of a single bulb, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The basement, which had always been cluttered with old furniture and storage boxes, now appeared more organized and strangely well used. It looked as though someone had been living there. A sense of dread washed over me as I spotted several items that didn't belong to me. A makeshift bed with blankets, a small camp stove, and a few personal belongings scattered around. It was clear that someone had been using my basement as a base of operations. I noticed a small, old-fashioned lockbox hidden behind a stack of boxes. My curiosity, mixed with fear, compelled me to open it. Inside, I found various documents and tools that suggested more than just casual use. There were detailed maps, surveillance equipment, and notebooks filled with handwritten notes. I took photographs of everything and carefully removed the items, ensuring I left the scene untouched for the police. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, reporting the intrusion and the discovery in the basement. An officer arrived promptly and began assessing the situation. They were visibly concerned by the organized setup in my basement and the equipment I had found. The officer took the items for forensic analysis, while another team examined the security system for signs of tampering. It was clear that whoever had been using my house had knowledge of security systems and was capable of disabling them without leaving obvious traces. While the police conducted their investigation, I was left to grapple with the invasion of my personal space and the unsettling realization that someone had been using my home as a base for unknown activities. I felt a mix of violation and fear, knowing that my sanctuary had been exploited by an intruder. Days passed, and the investigation yielded some intriguing findings. The documents found in the lockbox revealed detailed plans, including surveillance of my home and notes on my routines. It became evident that the intruder had been monitoring me closely and had been meticulous in their planning. The police were able to trace some of the equipment to a local supplier, which provided additional leads on potential suspects. The breakthrough came when the police identified a former employee from a company I had done business with. This person had a background in security systems and was familiar with how to bypass them. It turned out they had been disgruntled after being terminated for misconduct and had used their skills to target me. The police arrested the individual, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. They had not only used my home as a base, but had also been involved in other similar activities targeting different locations. The arrest brought a sense of relief, but the emotional impact of the invasion remained. In the aftermath, I took extensive measures to enhance the security of my home. I upgraded my security system to a more advanced model, installed additional surveillance cameras, and increased the security measures around the perimeter. I also engaged a security consultant to conduct regular checks and ensure that my home remained secure. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about the importance of vigilance and proactive security measures. I became more aware of potential threats and learned to trust my instincts when something felt off. The intrusion was a harsh reminder of how vulnerable one can be, even in the supposed safety of their own home. Over time, I worked to rebuild my sense of security and regain control over my living space. The fear of another intrusion gradually diminished as I took steps to fortify my home and enhance my personal safety. The ordeal, though deeply unsettling, strengthened my resolve to protect my privacy and maintain a secure environment. The incident also served as a reminder of the importance of staying informed about security systems and regularly reviewing and updating them. It was a sobering experience, but it ultimately led to a greater awareness of the need for vigilance and the value of taking proactive steps to safeguard one's home and personal space. Story 11. I had been hearing strange noises coming from my attic for days. At first I thought it was just the house settling, or perhaps the wind rattling the old wooden beams. But as the nights went on, the sounds grew more distinct: scratching, shuffling, and sometimes a soft tapping. It was as though something was moving up there, something that didn't belong. I tried to ignore it at first, convincing myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I had heard strange things in this house before. But the noises persisted, each night louder than the last. I could no longer dismiss it as nothing, and curiosity started to outweigh my fear. One evening, after a particularly unsettling sound, a loud thump followed by a dragging noise, I decided to investigate. My heart raced as I made my way up the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The air grew colder the closer I got, and my breath seemed to fog in front of me, even though it was a warm summer evening. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a shadow moving across the floor of the attic. My pulse quickened, and I hesitated for a moment. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but the presence of something or someone up there felt undeniably real. I could barely make out the shape of the shadow as it flickered across the floor, and my mind raced with thoughts of what it could be. Taking a deep breath, I slowly reached for the attic door. My hand trembled as I turned the old brass knob, the door creaking open with a sound that echoed through the quiet house. I peered into the attic, half expecting to see some figure standing there, but the space was eerily still. There was no one in sight. The attic, though dusty and filled with forgotten belongings, seemed undisturbed. The shadow I had seen moments ago was gone, and there was nothing out of place. I stepped inside, feeling a mix of confusion and unease. My eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement or explanation for the strange noises. I noticed the usual clutter of old furniture, boxes of things that hadn't been touched in years, and piles of forgotten memories. There was an old rocking chair in the corner, its wood worn with age, but nothing that could explain the noises I had been hearing. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. In the center of the room, on the floor, was a single item that didn't belong. It was a small, old-fashioned music box, its intricate carvings almost hidden by the dust that had settled around it. I knelt down, reaching for it with trembling hands. The box was cold to the touch, as if it had been waiting there for a long time. I turned it over in my hands, studying its delicate features. There was something oddly familiar about the box, but I couldn't place where I had seen it before. The more I looked at it, the more unsettled I became. It was beautiful in an eerie way, but the longer I held it, the more I felt as though I was intruding on something I shouldn't have touched. As I examined the box, I noticed something strange. There was no key, no obvious way to wind it up. But as I held it, I heard a soft, faint melody begin to play. It was a haunting tune, one I couldn't quite recognize, but it seemed to echo in my mind, filling the empty space of the attic. The music was soft at first, barely audible, but as I listened, it grew louder, more insistent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I quickly stood up, clutching the box in my hands. The room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around me deepened, stretching out like dark fingers. I could feel a presence, as if I were no longer alone in the attic. My heart raced, and I took a step back, my eyes darting around the room, looking for any sign of movement. The music played on, its eerie melody wrapping around my mind, pulling me deeper into the strange atmosphere of the attic. I wanted to leave, to run back downstairs and forget I had ever come up here, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was as though the music had a hold on me, drawing me in, forcing me to listen. Suddenly, the shadows shifted again, and I heard a soft rustling behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The rocking chair in the corner was moving, slowly rocking back and forth as if someone had just sat in it. But the room was empty, there was no one there. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the chair, which continued to rock in the silence. The music from the box seemed to intensify, as though it were reacting to the movement. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but all I could feel was the overwhelming sense of dread creeping over me. I turned and fled from the attic, slamming the door behind me as I ran down the stairs. My legs felt weak, and my hands shook as I held the music box, which was still playing its haunting melody. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I had to get out of that house, away from whatever force had taken hold of me. The music continued to play as I reached the front door, but when I opened it to step outside, the melody abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I looked down at the box in my hands, my breath coming in short gasps, and for the first time, I noticed something strange etched into the bottom. My name was carved into the wood. Story 12. I had always enjoyed the quiet of late-night train rides. There was something calming about the rhythm of the tracks, the soft hum of the engine, and the solitude of the nearly empty carriages. It was peaceful, a perfect way to unwind after a long day. On this particular night, however, that peace was shattered by an unsettling presence. I first noticed him when I sat down across from the empty row of seats. He was in the far corner of the train car, sitting in the shadows, his figure barely visible except for the faint reflection of the overhead lights. At first I thought nothing of it, assuming he was just another tired traveler. But then I realized he was staring at me, his eyes locked onto mine without a single blink. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to ignore the feeling of his gaze burning into me. Every time I glanced away, I could feel his eyes following me, lingering in the corner of my vision. It was as if he was studying me, watching my every move. I tried to distract myself by looking out the window, but the eerie sensation remained, gnawing at my thoughts. The train was mostly empty, save for a few scattered passengers. The car felt too quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rattle of the tracks and the faint murmur of the other riders. I glanced around, hoping someone else might notice the strange man, but everyone else seemed absorbed in their own worlds. It was just me and him, and the longer I sat there, the more it felt like the space between us was shrinking. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. Maybe he was just tired, or perhaps he was lost in thought. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His stare was intense, unwavering, as though he was waiting for me to make the next move. I couldn't understand why he wasn't blinking, why his gaze never wavered. As the minutes dragged on, I began to feel trapped. The train ride felt endless, and the silence between us grew heavier with each passing second. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, my breath shallow. Every time I tried to focus on something else, my eyes would instinctively return to him. He was still there, unmoving, his gaze fixed on me like a predator sizing up its prey. The feeling of being watched intensified as the train sped through the dark countryside. The flickering lights above cast strange shadows across his face, making his expression hard to read. He didn't seem to be looking at anything in particular, just me. I started to wonder if he was even aware of anything else around him, if he had noticed the other passengers getting off at their stops, or if he had been there the entire time, watching me without anyone else noticing. When the train made a sudden stop, I decided it was time to get off. The moment I stood up from my seat, I could feel his eyes following me. My legs felt unsteady, like they were moving of their own accord, urging me to leave the train as quickly as possible. I grabbed my bag, trying to act casual, but the unease was overwhelming. I couldn't get off the train fast enough. As I approached the door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The man had followed me. He was standing just a few feet behind me, his face still obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his presence. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I didn't dare look back. I could feel him right behind me, as if he were waiting for me to make the first move. I froze, my hand still on the door. The train was slowing down, preparing to make another stop, but the atmosphere felt thick with tension. I wanted to scream, to demand why he was following me, but my throat felt dry. My voice stuck somewhere deep inside. I could hear my heart beat in my ears, loud and frantic, as if it were trying to warn me. But what was there to do? I was trapped. I glanced at the door handle, considering making a run for it, but my feet felt heavy. I was paralyzed, unable to make the move I knew I had to. I couldn't understand why I felt so powerless, why this stranger's presence was so suffocating. I wasn't some helpless victim, yet here I was, standing frozen in place as this man, who hadn't said a word, slowly inched closer. Finally, I mustered enough courage to turn the handle and step off the train. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and I stepped into the dimly lit platform. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but it didn't help shake the fear that gripped my chest. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see him right behind me, but he wasn't there. I turned quickly, scanning the train car through the windows. The man was still inside, sitting motionless in the corner, staring out into the night. He hadn't moved. He hadn't even blinked. I could hardly breathe, my chest tightening as I realized the truth. He wasn't following me at all. He had been watching me the entire time, waiting for me to make the first move, to acknowledge him. The train pulled away, and the lights inside flickered, casting strange shadows on the empty seats. I stood there, unable to move, as the train disappeared into the distance. My heart still raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, even now, he was still watching me from somewhere in the darkness. I turned and walked away, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty station. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never take a late-night train again. Story 13. I was volunteering at the local food bank one crisp Saturday afternoon. It was one of those rare days when the sun peeked through the overcast sky, casting a warm glow over the busy space. The food bank was a small, bustling operation, full of volunteers sorting donations and helping the community. As usual, I found myself working in the back, where we stored the canned goods and dry items. That's when I first noticed him, a man in his mid-40s, wearing a weathered jacket and a hat that obscured most of his face. He approached me casually, offering a shy smile as he began to help with sorting cans. At first, I didn't think much of it. Many of the people who came to volunteer were just regular folks, often with quiet dispositions. However, this man seemed different. He kept glancing at me while we worked, and every time our eyes met, he smiled, but there was something off about it, something that felt too eager. As the hours passed, his questions grew more personal. He asked about my job, my family, even about my hobbies. At first, I thought he was just being friendly, trying to make small talk like anyone else. But the questions became more pointed, almost as if he was trying to piece together my life. "Do you live around here?" he asked casually, leaning in a little too close. "What do you do for fun when you're not here?" I answered as politely as I could, trying to keep the conversation light. Still, the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off, telling myself he was just being friendly. But the more I interacted with him, the more unsettling it became. He seemed to take an unusual interest in my answers, hanging on every word I said. The way he tilted his head as I spoke, as if trying to read between the lines, only made me more uncomfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He wasn't just a volunteer, he was observing me in a way that felt intrusive. By the end of my shift, I was ready to leave. The food bank was winding down for the evening, and I gathered my things, ready to head home. As I stepped outside, I saw him again. He was standing near the corner of the parking lot, leaning against the brick wall of the building, watching me. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach drop. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I tried to ignore him as I walked to my car, my footsteps quickening. I glanced over my shoulder once, and there he was still watching. He hadn't moved. I felt my heart race as I unlocked my car door and slid into the driver's seat. My hands trembled slightly as I started the engine, trying to push away the uneasy feeling that clung to me. I drove off, but I couldn't shake the image of his face from my mind. Later that night, as I sat in my apartment, the events of the day replayed in my mind. I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread. Why had he been so interested in me? What had he wanted? I thought about the way he watched me from the parking lot, his gaze never wavering. I wondered if it had just been my imagination running wild, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. There was something unsettling about his presence, something that felt off. As the hours passed, I began to relax, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. It was late, and I was tired. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But then around midnight, I heard a faint noise outside my window. It was a soft rustling sound, as if someone was walking slowly past my apartment. My heart skipped a beat. I got up and peeked through the blinds, but the street outside was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly backed away from the window. I spent the rest of the night with the curtains drawn and the lights on, too anxious to sleep. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Had I imagined it? Had he really been following me, or was I just overreacting? My mind raced with questions, but no answers seemed to come. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I decided to go to the food bank again, hoping that maybe it had all been a misunderstanding. When I arrived, I noticed the man wasn't there. I felt a brief sense of relief, but it didn't last long. As I walked inside, I saw one of the regular volunteers, an older woman who had been working there for years. I casually asked if she knew anything about the man who had been volunteering the day before. She paused for a moment, her expression changing. "Oh, him," she said, lowering her voice. "He's been coming here off and on for months. He's a bit of a loner, keeps to himself. But he's never really stuck around for long." I frowned, trying to hide my unease. Has he ever made anyone feel uncomfortable? The woman looked at me with a knowing expression. "You're not the first person to ask about him. He's harmless, but he does have a way of making people uneasy. Some of the other volunteers have mentioned it too. I think he's just lonely." I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just my imagination then. Something about this man was unsettling to everyone. The thought that he had been watching me, asking personal questions, and following me made my stomach churn. I decided then that I wouldn't be returning to the food bank for a while. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there watching me. The unease lingered, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I went out. Every time I stepped outside, I half expected to see him standing in the distance, his eyes locked onto mine. The fear never fully left, and I began to feel trapped in my own routine. Even in the safety of my home, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. I eventually moved to a new city, hoping to leave that experience behind me. But the memory of that man, the way he watched me, and the unsettling feeling he left still lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't help but wonder if he was still out there, following me, waiting for the right moment to make himself known again. Story 14. I had driven for what felt like hours to visit my friend in a quiet, remote neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The winding roads were surrounded by thick trees, and the houses were spaced far apart, their yards overgrown with wild grasses and ivy. It was a peaceful place, one that seemed frozen in time, with little traffic and an almost eerie sense of stillness. My friend Emma had warned me that the area could feel a little isolated, but I didn't think much of it at the time. When I arrived at her house, a small cottage tucked away behind tall hedges, I was greeted with a warm smile and an invitation to stay for the evening. The house had an old charm, with its creaky wooden floors and dimly lit rooms. We sat on the porch for a while, catching up on life and enjoying the cool evening air. As we chatted, I noticed a group of people standing near the end of the street, just beyond the reach of the porch light. At first, I thought they were just a group of neighbors, perhaps passing through or taking a stroll. But as the minutes passed, I began to feel uncomfortable. The people didn't seem to be moving, they just stood there, watching us. There were 5 of them, all wearing dark clothing, their faces obscured by shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but the way they stood still, not speaking, or even acknowledging our presence, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to ignore them, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe they were waiting for someone, or perhaps they were just a strange group of people out for a late walk. Emma seemed unaware of them, continuing to chat as if nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that I was being watched. I glanced at the group again, and this time one of them shifted slightly, as if acknowledging my gaze. It was subtle, but it sent a chill down my spine. Eventually, Emma and I decided to go inside. The air had grown colder, and I was ready to put the strange encounter behind me. But as we entered the house, I couldn't help but glance out the window where I saw the group still standing there, unmoving. The sight made my stomach turn, and I quickly pulled the curtains shut, hoping it was just my overactive imagination playing tricks on me. The evening passed without incident, but the unease lingered in the back of my mind. After a while, I decided it was time to head home. Emma offered to drive me, but I declined, wanting to enjoy the quiet drive back. I said my goodbyes and stepped outside, the night air now thick with a sense of tension. As I made my way to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again. I quickly unlocked the car and got in, trying to shake off the lingering discomfort. I started the engine, and as I pulled away from the house, I glanced in the rearview mirror. To my horror, I saw the same group of people standing at the end of the street, watching me as I drove off. They hadn't moved from their spot, and their eyes seemed fixed on my car, following my every move. I quickly turned the corner, hoping to lose sight of them, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. As I drove through the quiet streets, the unease in my chest grew. I couldn't help but glance in my mirror, certain that I was being followed. The roads were dark, with only the faint glow of streetlights to illuminate my path. But no matter how many turns I took, the feeling that someone was behind me never left. I tried to convince myself it was just the quiet of the night playing tricks on me, but every turn seemed to confirm my fear. The further I drove, the more paranoid I became. I began to check my mirrors constantly, certain that the group was still behind me, watching my every move. Each time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw nothing but the empty road, but the feeling of being followed only intensified. It was as if they were right there, just out of sight, their presence a constant weight pressing on my chest. As I approached a stretch of road that was completely isolated, the headlights of another car appeared behind me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, another car on the road. But as I took a sharp turn, the car behind me followed, its headlights blinding in my mirror. My heart raced as I sped up, hoping to lose them, but the car stayed with me, matching my every move. I was no longer just paranoid, I was terrified. I took another turn, this time into a narrow alleyway, hoping to shake the car off my tail. But when I looked in the rearview mirror again, the car was gone. I stopped in the middle of the road, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, and waited. The street was empty, and the silence that followed was almost suffocating. My breath came in short gasps, and I couldn't understand what was happening. The feeling of being watched still hadn't gone away. It was as if the group from Emma's neighborhood was still following me, their presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I drove for miles, each turn and intersection only increasing my sense of dread. It felt like I couldn't escape, like I was being trapped in some strange game I didn't understand. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I arrived at a well-lit area with more traffic. The streets were busier, and the familiar noise of the city felt like a relief. I slowed down, my hands still shaking, and looked around. There was no sign of the group or the car that had followed me. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again, but the unease still lingered, a quiet, nagging fear in the back of my mind. I never told Emma about the strange group or the feeling of being followed. I didn't want to worry her, and part of me wasn't sure if I had imagined it all. But every time I think back to that night, I can't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that I had been watched and followed by something I couldn't explain. Story 15. I stopped at a roadside diner for a quick meal. The small, neon sign flickered above the door as I walked in, its dim light casting an eerie glow on the empty parking lot. Inside, the diner was warm, a comforting escape from the cold wind outside. I sat down at a booth near the window, glancing over the menu as I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. As I waited for the waitress to take my order, a man approached my table. He was wearing a weathered jacket and had a rough, scruffy beard. His eyes locked onto mine, and before I could say anything, he began speaking as if we were old friends. He casually mentioned my job, my family, and my friends, and my stomach twisted in confusion. How did he know these things? I had never seen him before in my life. The more he spoke, the more unsettled I became. He went on to mention that he knew exactly where I had been that morning, down to the smallest detail. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My mind raced, trying to figure out how this stranger could possibly know so much about me. I forced a smile and tried to laugh off, hoping it was all just some weird coincidence. But the man didn't stop. He leaned closer to my booth, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. He asked me about places I had visited in the past week, things I had done, and people I had talked to. It felt as if he had been watching me, tracking my every move. I could barely respond, my words getting caught in my throat as the weight of his knowledge sank in. I tried to change the subject, but it was no use. The man seemed to be completely fixated on me, as if he knew every detail of my life. His eyes never left mine, and his presence was overwhelming. I glanced around the diner, hoping for someone to intervene, but the place was nearly empty. The waitress hadn't returned, and the cook was busy in the back, unaware of the conversation unfolding. Finally, I stood up, hoping to escape the strange man's relentless questioning. "I think I need to go," I said, my voice trembling. But before I could even grab my jacket, he stepped into my path. "Let me walk you to your car," he insisted, his voice calm and almost too polite. The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I had no idea why he was being so persistent, but something in my gut told me I needed to get away from him as quickly as possible. I hesitated for a moment, weighing my options. I could try to make a run for it, but the diner's small layout meant I'd have to pass him to reach the door. The man was blocking my exit, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was more than just a stranger who happened to know a few things about me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my feet felt frozen in place. The man didn't wait for me to respond. He started walking toward the door, glancing over his shoulder to make sure I was following. I reluctantly followed him, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't help but feel like I was being led into some kind of trap. Every step I took felt heavier, as if I was sinking deeper into a situation I didn't understand. When we reached the door, the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. The man held the door open for me, his smile never faltering. I stepped outside, but the unease in my chest only grew stronger. The parking lot was empty, and my car was parked at the far end, far from the streetlights. It was too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man walked beside me, his pace steady as we approached my car. I didn't dare look at him, my eyes fixed on the car door. My hands fumbled with my keys, my fingers shaking as I tried to unlock the door. I could hear the man's footsteps behind me, and I could feel his presence like a weight on my shoulders. I finally managed to unlock the door and slipped inside, slamming it shut behind me. Before I could start the car, the man knocked on my window. My heart skipped a beat as I looked up, seeing his face pressed against the glass. His smile was still there, but it no longer felt friendly. There was something dark behind his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. I quickly started the engine, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I threw the car into reverse. The man stepped back, watching me with that same unnerving smile. I didn't waste any time. I threw the car into drive and sped out of the parking lot, my tires screeching on the pavement. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching me as I drove away. My mind raced with questions. How had he known so much about me? Why had he followed me? What did he want? Why? As I drove down the empty road, I tried to calm my racing heart. I glanced in the rearview mirror. half expecting to see his car following me, but there was nothing. The road behind me was dark and empty, just as it should be. But the feeling of unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the image of the man's face from my mind. I drove for what felt like hours, taking turns I hadn't planned on, hoping to lose any trace of him. Eventually, I found a small gas station and pulled over, my hands still trembling. I filled my car with gas, keeping a careful eye on the surroundings. When I got back into my car, I made sure to lock the doors before I started the engine. I drove off, but the strange encounter at the diner stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I couldn't explain it, and I wasn't sure I ever wanted to. All I knew was that I wouldn't stop until I was far away from that roadside diner and the man who seemed to know everything about me. Story 16. I was at a friend's house for the weekend, enjoying a quiet visit in a cozy, old neighborhood. The house itself was charming, with creaky wooden floors and antique furniture that gave it a sense of history. My friend Sarah had recently moved in and was eager to show me around. We spent the afternoon catching up, but as night began to fall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the place. It started innocently enough, with a series of faint noises that seemed to come from the attic. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, as Sarah had explained. The wind outside was howling and the old beams and timbers of the house groaned under the pressure. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy as the noises continued, soft thumps and scratching sounds that seemed to echo in the quiet of the house. Sarah noticed my discomfort and tried to reassure me. "It's just the house, don't worry about it," she said with a laugh. "Old houses do that. Nothing to be afraid of." But despite her words, I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling growing inside me. There was something about the noises that felt deliberate, like someone or something was up there moving around. That night, as we sat in the living room watching a movie, I heard the noises again. This time they were louder, more distinct. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the attic floor. I glanced over at Sarah, but she didn't seem to notice. She was engrossed in the film, her attention elsewhere, while I sat frozen, staring at the ceiling. "Sarah, do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She paused the movie and looked at me, a puzzled expression crossing her face. "Hear what?" she asked, her gaze drifting upward. "The footsteps," I replied, my heart beginning to race. "It sounds like someone's up there." She smiled reassuringly. "It's just the house. Trust me, there's no one up there. It's probably just the wind or the house settling again." I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it lingered, settling deep in my chest. That night, as I lay in the guest room, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind outside seemed amplified in the silence. My eyes kept darting toward the attic door, which was just down the hall. I told myself it was nothing, but the thought of someone or something being up there gnawed at me. The next evening, after dinner, Sarah went out to run some errands, leaving me alone in the house. I was trying to relax, reading a book in the living room, when I heard the noises again. This time they were more pronounced, distinct footsteps that sounded heavier, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the attic. My stomach twisted into knots, and I set my book aside, my curiosity and fear warring inside me. I walked cautiously toward the stairs, my feet barely making a sound as I ascended. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, casting a dark shadow in the hallway. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the door, trying to gather the courage to investigate. The air felt thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard it a whisper. It was soft at first, just a faint sound, but then it grew clearer. "Come up here," it whispered, and then it spoke my name. "Come up here, Emily." My blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable, and yet it didn't sound like Sarah. It wasn't her voice, and it certainly didn't sound like anything human. I froze, my mind racing. There was no way Sarah could have gotten back so soon. The voice had come from above, from the attic, and it was calling me by name. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to the attic was now wide open, the darkness inside swallowing the light from the hallway. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand trembling on the railing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The whispering continued, growing more insistent, almost pleading. "Emily, come up here," it repeated. "I'm waiting." The logical part of my mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of the house, but something kept me rooted in place. It wasn't just the voice that held me, it was the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, as if the very walls were watching me. I glanced toward the front door, wondering if I should make a run for it, but the thought of stepping into the night alone was just as terrifying as whatever was in the attic. In the end, it was my fight or flight instincts that took over. I turned and ran down the stairs, slamming the door behind me as I left the house. I didn't stop until I reached the street, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't know what had been up there, but I knew I wasn't going back inside to find out. Sarah came home shortly after, and when I explained what had happened, she just stared at me, wide-eyed. She told me that she had always heard strange things in the house, but she never mentioned them to anyone. Apparently, her family had lived there for years, and the house had a reputation for being haunted, though Sarah never took it seriously. The next day, we both returned to the house to investigate, but the attic door was locked, and the house was eerily quiet. I never heard the footsteps or the whispers again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, waiting. I left Sarah's house that day, and I haven't been back since. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear that whisper, calling my name from above. Story 17. I had just moved into a new apartment, excited to start fresh in a new city. The building was older, but it had character, with creaky floors and vintage fixtures that gave it a sense of charm. The neighborhood was quiet, with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors who waved as I carried boxes into my new place. Everything seemed perfect at first, and I felt optimistic about the new chapter in my life. The first strange gift appeared on my doorstep a few days after I moved in. It was a small, neatly wrapped package with a bright yellow ribbon. There was no note, no card, just a single, creepy smiley face carved into the top of the wrapping paper. It was so out of place that I didn't know whether to be curious or alarmed. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. My first instinct was to ignore it, but my curiosity got the best of me. I carefully unwrapped the package, only to find a small, hand-carved wooden figure inside, shaped like a clown. The craftsmanship was impressive, but something about it made my skin crawl. The clown's smile was exaggerated, its eyes too wide. I decided to throw the figure away, not wanting to deal with whatever strange game this was. But the next day there was another package on my doorstep, identical to the first. This time it was a small box with a twisted metal key inside, again with a smiley face carved into the lid. My heart began to race. What kind of person would do this? I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just some weird prank. I considered talking to the building manager, but something held me back. I didn't want to sound paranoid or make a fuss over what could just be an odd coincidence, but deep down I felt like something wasn't right. Over the next few days, more gifts appeared. One was a tattered old book with a yellowed poed cover and no title, its pages filled with strange symbols. Another was a small glass jar with a single black feather inside. Each time there was the same creepy smiley face, carved with precision. Whoever was leaving these gifts clearly knew what they were doing. The gifts started to feel like an obsession. It wasn't just the items themselves that unsettled me, but the fact that they were left in the exact same spot on my doorstep every time. Whoever was doing this was watching me, waiting for me to find their strange offerings. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being targeted. One evening, after returning from work, I found yet another package waiting for me. This time it was different. The box was larger than the others, and there was a note taped to it. My hands trembled as I pulled it off. The note was simple, just a few words written in messy, almost childish handwriting. "I'm just getting started." I stared at the note for a long time, my heart pounding. This wasn't a prank anymore. Whoever was doing this had crossed a line. I felt like I was being stalked, like I was living in someone's twisted game. I quickly brought the box inside, hoping to find something that would explain who was behind this. Inside the box was a small, old-fashioned mirror, its surface cracked and cloudy. There was a strange symbol etched into the back, one I didn't recognize. As I held it, I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the reflection. I quickly turned away, convinced I was just imagining things. The next day, I went to work, hoping the strange gifts would stop, but they didn't. When I returned home, I found another gift on my doorstep, just like the others. But this time, something was different. I noticed a figure standing at the end of the hallway, just outside my door. The person was facing me, standing completely still, as if they were waiting for me to notice them. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out his posture. He was standing there, just staring at me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I felt paralyzed, trapped in the hallway with this stranger. For a long moment, I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but I was too afraid to take my eyes off the figure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he slowly turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the building. My legs felt weak, and I stumbled back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night in a state of panic, constantly checking the peephole, making sure the figure didn't return. I was too afraid to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of who this person was and what they wanted from me. The gifts, the notes, the eerie smiley face, everything seemed to be leading to this moment. The next day, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and called a friend, asking if I could stay with them for a while. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer, not with someone watching me. I told the building manager about the gifts and the figure in the hallway, but they assured me there was nothing they could do unless I had proof. I left that night, not looking back. The gifts stopped after I moved out, but the memory of that figure standing in the hallway still haunts me. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I'll never forget the way they stared at me. The apartment was never the same after that, and I never went back. Story 18. I had just finished my late-night shift at the convenience store and was making my way home. The streets were mostly empty, with only the occasional car passing by, its headlights slicing through the darkness. It was a cool night, the kind that made your breath visible in the air. and I was grateful for the quiet. The only sound was the rhythm of my footsteps on the sidewalk as I walked down the familiar route that led to my apartment. As I turned a corner, a car suddenly pulled up next to me, its engine humming softly in the stillness. I glanced over, startled, to see a man sitting behind the wheel, his face illuminated by the glow of the dashboard lights. He gave me a friendly smile and rolled down the window. "Hey, do you need a ride?" he asked, his voice casual but a little too insistent for the time of night. I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond. There was something about his tone that made me uneasy, but I tried to brush it off. "No, thanks," I said quickly, my pace quickening as I moved a step away from the car. I didn't want to seem rude, but I also didn't want to get any closer to this stranger, especially so late at night. The man didn't seem to take my refusal well. He leaned slightly forward in his seat, watching me with an expression that didn't match his smile. "Are you sure?" he asked again, his voice a little too persistent. "It's really late, and I could give you a ride home. It's dangerous out here." I gave a tight-lipped smile, shaking my head. "I'm good, thanks." I started walking faster, eager to put some distance between us. The street lights flickered overhead as I kept my eyes focused on the path ahead, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. As I moved further down the street, I glanced back over my shoulder, just to make sure the car had driven off. To my surprise, the headlights were still there, and the car was now moving slowly behind me, maintaining a steady distance. My heart skipped a beat, and a chill ran down my spine. I quickened my pace, trying to remain calm, but the sound of the engine following me only seemed to grow louder. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the driver was just going in the same direction, or maybe he had turned around to head back home. But as the car kept following, my anxiety grew. The more I walked, the slower the car seemed to go, as if it was deliberately matching my steps. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, and each time the car was still there, trailing me at a distance. I reached an intersection, and the car slowed even further, coming to a stop at the corner as if waiting for me to make a decision. My instincts screamed at me to be cautious, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I could have just been overthinking the situation. I crossed the street, trying to act casual, but when I glanced back again, the car had followed me across the intersection. Panic began to settle in, my mind racing as I tried to think of what to do. I couldn't just keep walking aimlessly. I needed to make sure I wasn't being followed. I turned a corner sharply, hoping to lose the car, but when I looked behind me, the headlights were still there, glowing faintly in the distance. It was as if the car was playing some sort of twisted game, deliberately keeping its distance but never letting me escape. I considered going into one of the nearby buildings or finding a well-lit area where there would be more people around. But the street was eerily quiet, and I didn't see anyone nearby. I knew the longer I kept walking, the more I was giving the car a chance to catch up. I felt like a rabbit being stalked by a predator, unable to outrun it no matter how fast I went. Then a thought crossed my mind. I could call the police. But as I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, I realized it was still in my bag, which was buried at the bottom of my backpack. The bag was a little too far from my reach, and I didn't want to take my eyes off the car for even a second. The headlights had drawn closer, and now I could hear the engine revving slightly, as if it was getting ready to move faster. I turned another corner, this time heading down a darker alley, hoping that the car wouldn't follow me into the narrow passage. I walked quickly, my steps echoing off the walls, and glanced back once more. To my relief, the car had stopped at the mouth of the alley, its headlights still on but not moving. For a moment, I thought I had finally shaken it off. But then, I saw the man. He was standing at the far end of the alley, just outside the car, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. He didn't approach, but the way he stood there, watching me, sent a jolt of fear through my chest. I had no idea how he had gotten out of the car so quickly, but the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just following me anymore. He was waiting for me to come closer. I didn't give him the chance. My heart racing, I turned around and ran back the way I had come, ignoring the ache in my legs as I sprinted down the street. The sound of the car's engine started up again, but this time, I didn't stop to look. I was too afraid to even check if it was still following me. I didn't stop running until I reached the front door of my building, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door and slammed it behind me. The security lights outside flickered on, and I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there somewhere watching. I didn't sleep that night, my mind replaying the events over and over. What if I hadn't gotten away? What if the car hadn't stopped following me? The fear lingered long after the adrenaline had worn off, and I knew that, from that night on, I would never walk home alone after dark again. Story 19. I was at the park with my dog, enjoying the early morning air. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass, and the park was quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds. My dog, a golden retriever named Max, bounded ahead, chasing after a ball I had thrown. It was a peaceful morning, the kind where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As Max ran ahead, I noticed a man walking along the path toward me. He was unremarkable at first glance, dressed in a worn jacket and jeans, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. He gave me a nod as he passed, and I returned the gesture with a smile. But something about him lingered in my mind, an unease that I couldn't shake. After a few moments, I noticed that the man had stopped and was now watching me from a distance. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to coincidence, but when I turned to look again, he had started walking in my direction. His pace was slow, almost deliberate, and I felt my stomach tighten with an odd sense of dread. Max trotted back to me, tail wagging, oblivious to the strange situation unfolding. The man was getting closer now, his footsteps light but purposeful. He didn't seem in a hurry, yet I couldn't help but feel like he was closing in on me. I picked up Max's leash and started walking away, hoping to shake off the growing sense of discomfort. But the man kept following, not in a rush, but with a steady, unyielding pace. I quickened my step, trying to make my way toward the park's exit, but I could hear his footsteps growing louder behind me. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, and I could feel the tension building in my chest. Max, sensing my unease, looked back at me with a confused expression. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" The man called out suddenly, his voice oddly sing-song. I turned, half expecting him to just be passing by, but instead he had closed the gap between us, standing just a few feet away. His eyes were wide, almost unnervingly so, and his lips curled into a small smile. Yeah, it is," I replied, trying to sound casual, though I could feel my heart racing. I wanted to ask why he was following me, but something told me it was better to keep the conversation short. He tilted his head, his smile widening. But does the day really know what it is? Does it know it's beautiful, or does it simply exist, waiting to be called such? His words didn't make sense, and I took a step back, trying to distance myself from him. but he seemed to notice, stepping forward as well. "Excuse me," I asked, my voice shaking slightly. Max started to growl softly, sensing my discomfort. The man's smile didn't fade. If anything, it grew more intense. "The day, the sun, the clouds, they all play their parts," he continued, his voice low and rhythmic, almost as if he were reciting a poem. "But who is to say if they understand what they do? Perhaps they are merely reflections of a greater design, lost in the dance of time." I didn't know what to say. His riddles were nonsensical, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to take another step back, but he followed, closing the distance between us with unnerving ease. His eyes locked onto mine, his gaze never wavering. "Where do you live?" he asked suddenly, his tone shifting to something more insistent. The question was so out of place that it took me a moment to process. My heart skipped a beat. "I'm sorry, but I really need to get going," I said, my voice firmer now. I turned to leave, tugging gently on Max's leash, but the man didn't stop. He was still following me, and I could hear his footsteps drawing closer, almost too close. "I don't want to bother you," he said, his voice low and smooth, "but I must know where you live. There are places only you can see, places only you know." His words were still wrapped in riddles, but the meaning behind them felt more sinister now. My pulse quickened, and I broke into a brisk walk, my eyes darting around for anyone who might be nearby. The park was still quiet, but I knew it was only a matter of time before I reached the main road. I kept walking, trying to keep my pace steady while Max continued to growl softly at the man behind us. "Please, I don't want to be rude," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "but I really need to leave." The man didn't seem to hear me. His steps were now so close that I could feel his presence at my back. He was just behind me, his shadow stretching across the path. He spoke again, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Do you know what the stars whisper when no one is listening? They speak of secrets, of hidden paths, of places where time doesn't exist. I can show you these places." I was almost running now, my breath coming faster as I reached the park exit. The man's voice grew fainter, but his footsteps didn't stop. I could feel him trailing me, just behind, and it was only when I reached the street that I finally turned and faced him. "You need to leave," I said firmly, my voice now sharp. "I'm not interested." Max was now barking, his teeth bared, and the man hesitated for a moment. He seemed to be studying me, his eyes flickering between me and Max. Then, as if he'd come to some silent decision, he smiled again. "I'll find you again," he said, his voice soft but with a hint of finality. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the park. I didn't wait to see if he would return. I quickly made my way to the street, where I called a friend to pick me up. I never went back to that park alone again, and I kept looking over my shoulder, wondering if the man would ever truly leave me alone. Story 20. I had just finished a long meeting at work when I noticed something strange outside my office building. It was a typical afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I glanced out the window, expecting to see the usual passers-by or cars heading home, but instead, my gaze locked onto a man in a suit standing by the sidewalk. His dark, tailored outfit seemed out of place for the time of day, and what struck me the most was his unmoving posture. His face turned toward the building as if he was waiting for something. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, just someone standing there while waiting for a ride or meeting someone. But as I continued to work, I found my eyes drawn to the window again and again. Every time I looked, he was still there, standing in the same spot, staring directly at me. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the intensity of his gaze that made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me for a reason, something far beyond mere curiosity. I tried to push the thought out of my mind and focused on the work in front of me. My colleagues were finishing up their own tasks, oblivious to the man outside. Yet, every time I glanced up from my computer, I couldn't help but look toward the window. There he was, still standing there, unmoving, his eyes locked onto mine as though he could see me through the glass. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that maybe he was just waiting for someone or looking at something else entirely. But the longer I stared, the more unnerving his presence became. By the time the workday was winding down, I couldn't ignore the discomfort building in my chest. The man was still there, standing like a statue. It wasn't even like he was trying to blend in with the surroundings. His stark, formal appearance only made him stand out more. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe he had a legitimate reason to be there, but I couldn't stop the creeping feeling of being watched. Every time I looked out the window, it was as if he was waiting for me to notice him. I tried to distract myself by finishing up some paperwork, but my thoughts kept returning to the man outside. I glanced at the clock. It was almost time to leave for the day. I thought about heading out through the back exit to avoid the man altogether, but something held me in place. I had to know who he was and why he was staring at me. The need for answers grew stronger, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Finally, I stood up from my desk and made my way to the window. As I drew closer, I hesitated, wondering if I was just being paranoid. But when I reached the glass, I looked down at the man, expecting to see him finally move, to break the strange, eerie stillness that had hung between us for hours. But no, he was still there, his eyes never leaving mine. It was as if time had stopped for him, as though he were frozen in place just for me. I felt a chill creep up my spine, and a wave of unease washed over me. I quickly stepped away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned back to my desk, hoping to shake the feeling that had taken hold of me. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just another person going about their day, and I had no reason to be so unsettled. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a coincidence. There was something wrong about the way he stared at me, something that felt deliberate, like he knew exactly who I was and what I was doing. I packed up my things, my movements automatic as I tried to push the lingering fear aside. As I walked toward the elevator, I couldn't help but glance back toward the window one last time. The man was still there, his eyes fixed on me, unmoving. It was as though he was waiting for something, waiting for me to make the next move. I quickly turned away, trying to shake off the feeling that something was about to happen. As I stepped into the elevator, I noticed that the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. The elevator doors closed with a soft ding, and I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling the weight of the building's oppressive atmosphere lift just a little. But as the elevator descended, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. What did he want? Why was he so focused on me? And why had I felt so certain that he was waiting for me to notice him? I reached the ground floor and exited the building, my mind still racing with questions. I glanced around the parking lot, half expecting to see the man still standing there, watching me. But the lot was empty, the only movement coming from a few cars pulling out. My heart still raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that something had just happened, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As I walked to my car, I told myself it was just a strange coincidence, that I had overthought the whole situation. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that I hadn't seen the last of that man. His stare had been too intense, too deliberate. It felt like he had been waiting for something to happen, something that had to do with me. I didn't know who he was or why he had been watching me, but I couldn't escape the feeling that this wasn't the end. Something about that encounter had changed something inside me, and I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever truly be free of the unsettling memory of that man in the suit. Story 21. It was a chilly evening when I decided to take a shortcut home through the alley behind the row of shops. I had walked this path countless times, a quick way to avoid the busy streets and get home before dark. The air was thick with the smell of rain, though the clouds hadn't yet opened up. I had no reason to feel uneasy. After all, the alley was familiar. The sounds of the city buzzing just beyond its narrow walls. But that night something felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I saw no one. My footsteps echoed off the brick walls, and the sound of my own breath seemed too loud in the stillness. As I hurried down the alley, my pace quickened, my eyes darting from side to side, trying to shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. I turned a corner, my mind distracted by the thoughts of getting home, when suddenly, a hand shot out from the shadows and grabbed my arm. My heart stopped in an instant, and I froze. The grip was firm, unyielding, as though the man had been waiting for this moment. He pulled me back into the shadows, his breath hot against my ear, and whispered in a voice that sent chills down my spine. "I know where you live," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I've been watching you for weeks." I tried to pull away, but his hold was like iron, and I felt the panic rising in my chest. My heart pounded in my ears as I twisted and jerked my arm, desperate to break free. I could feel his fingers digging into my skin, and the realization that I was alone in the alley, with no one around to hear me, made my blood run cold. My breath quickened, and I forced myself to stay calm, knowing that if I panicked, I would never get away. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I yanked my arm out of his grasp. For a brief moment I was free, but only for a heartbeat. As I turned to run, the man lunged at me again, his hand brushing my shoulder as I dodged his grasp. My legs moved faster than they ever had, and I could hear him right behind me, his footsteps growing louder with each passing second. I dashed toward the end of the alley, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the man was relentless. His voice followed me, cold and calculating. "You can't outrun me. I know where you live, and I'm not letting you go." My heart raced as I reached the alley's exit, the dim streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I glanced over my shoulder, but the man was too close. I didn't know how much farther I could run, but I couldn't stop now. I needed to get to safety, to anyone who could help. I reached the street, hoping to find someone, anyone who might be nearby, but the street was eerily empty. It was as though the city had swallowed everyone up, leaving only me and this man in the quiet, darkened streets. The wind howled through the alley behind me, but there was no sign of anyone around to hear my desperate cries. I glanced down the street and saw my apartment building in the distance. It felt like miles away, but I knew I had to get there. My legs burned and my chest ached, but I pushed myself harder, my eyes fixed on the entrance to the building. I couldn't let him catch me, not now, not when I was so close to safety. I heard the man's footsteps again, closing in on me, and my panic surged. I could feel him gaining on me, his breath coming faster as he grew nearer. The fear was overwhelming, and I felt like I was running on pure instinct now, not even thinking about the steps I was taking, just focused on getting away. Finally, I reached the door to my building and slammed my hand against the buzzer. The man was still behind me, too close for comfort, but I didn't dare look back. I just kept pounding on the buzzer, praying someone inside would hear me. The seconds felt like hours, and my hands were shaking, my mind racing. Finally, the door opened, and I rushed inside, barely able to catch my breath. The man stopped just outside, his silhouette framed in the doorway. For a moment we stood there, facing each other through the glass. I could see his cold, calculating eyes watching me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart still racing. I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The man's words echoed in my mind, and I realized that he wasn't just some random stranger. He had been watching me, following me for weeks. He knew where I lived. I turned to the building's lobby, my eyes scanning for any sign of someone who could help. The place was empty, just like the street had been. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do next. Should I call the police? Should I move? But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The man hadn't just let me go. He was still out there, still watching. I took the stairs to my apartment, every creak of the building making me jump. I kept checking over my shoulder, but there was no sign of him. When I finally reached my floor, I felt a brief moment of relief. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence in my apartment felt oppressive, and the fear still clung to me like a second skin. I locked the door behind me, double-checking it, and went to the window. I pulled the curtain aside, peering out into the street below, but the man was gone. For now. Story 22. It was a peaceful evening, the kind I had grown to cherish after a long week of work. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a soft orange glow across the sky. I had settled into my favorite chair, a cup of tea in hand, the quiet of my home wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. The world outside felt distant, and I relished the stillness, unaware that the calm would soon be shattered. The sudden ring of the doorbell broke through the tranquility, making me jump slightly. I glanced at the clock. It was late, too late for a regular visitor. Hesitant, I stood up and walked toward the door, wondering who could be at my doorstep at this hour. When I opened it, I was greeted by nothing but the cool night air and the empty darkness of the street. I looked up and down the street, but there was no sign of anyone. No cars parked, no footsteps echoing on the pavement, just the silence of the neighborhood. My curiosity grew, but there was nothing to explain the doorbell's chime. It wasn't until I turned to close the door that I noticed something on the doorstep and unmarked. Large package sitting there, as if it had materialized out of nowhere. My heart skipped a beat as I bent down to pick it up. The box was heavier than I expected, wrapped in plain brown paper, no name or return address to be found. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The strange feeling that had begun to settle in my chest made me hesitate, but I couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. I carried the package inside and placed it on the coffee table. Sitting down, I carefully began to unwrap the paper. My hands trembled slightly as I peeled back the layers, revealing a plain cardboard box underneath. There was no indication of what was inside, no hint of its contents. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, before lifting the lid. The first thing that caught my eye was a photograph. The photo was of me taken earlier that day. It was a candid shot, the kind someone might take when you're not paying attention. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a coincidence, but as I stared at the picture, something about it made my skin crawl. I didn't recognize the location, and yet it was unmistakably me, wearing the same clothes I had on earlier. The realization hit me, someone had been watching me. I turned the photo over, my hands shaking now, and saw the message scrawled in neat but unfamiliar handwriting, "I'll be watching." My breath caught in my throat as I read the words again. The sentence felt like a warning, like a promise that someone was keeping an eye on me, and the thought sent a chill through my body. I wasn't sure if I should be more frightened by the photo or the message itself. The house felt suddenly too quiet, too empty. I looked around, half expecting someone to be standing just out of view, watching me from the shadows. My mind raced as I tried to piece together any explanation for the package. Who would do something like this? And why? My phone sat on the table, but I hesitated to call the police. What could I say? Someone sent me a photo of myself and said they'd be watching me. It sounded ridiculous, but the fear that gripped me was anything but. I stood up and began pacing, trying to make sense of it all. I had no enemies, no one I could think of who would do something like this. My life was ordinary, my interactions limited to work, family, and friends. But someone had clearly been following me, and that thought was enough to send a wave of panic through my chest. I moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside to peer into the street, but there was no one there, no sign of movement. I walked back to the table, the photo still lying in front of me. I stared at it, my mind racing through all the possibilities. Had someone been watching me for days? Was this just the beginning? The questions seemed endless, but no answers came. My phone vibrated suddenly, making me jump. I grabbed it quickly, hoping it was a message that would provide some clarity, but it was just a notification from an app I hadn't used in days. I looked back at the photo, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than a prank, but the feeling of unease in my stomach told me otherwise. I was no longer alone in my home, and that thought terrified me. The silence that had once been comforting now felt oppressive, suffocating. I glanced at the door, wondering if whoever had left the package was still out there, waiting. I considered leaving, but the idea of stepping out into the dark streets with the unsettling feeling that someone was watching me seemed far worse. I didn't know who or why, but I had a growing sense that I was being targeted. I thought about checking the security cameras around my house, but the fear of what I might find held me back. What if I saw something, or worse, someone lurking just outside? I paced back and forth, the photo still clutched in my hand, my thoughts spinning. The message on the back haunted me. "I'll be watching." It felt like a threat, like a warning of something more sinister to come. I thought about calling a friend, but what could I say? The package had been delivered without a trace, and I had no idea where to start looking for answers. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how helpless I felt. Whoever had sent the package knew me, knew my routine, and that made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't experienced before. I looked around the room again, but nothing seemed out of place. No one was hiding in the shadows, yet the feeling of being watched persisted. I decided to keep the photo with me, unable to shake the thought that the person who had sent it might be closer than I thought. The silence in my house was deafening, and I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that someone was still watching, waiting for me to make the next move. I had no idea what to do next, but I knew one thing for sure: my life would never feel the same again. Story 23. I was strolling through the mall on a quiet afternoon, enjoying the hum of shoppers and the soft background music playing overhead. The day was relatively uneventful, and I was simply browsing through a few stores, not in any particular hurry. The mall was less crowded than usual, which was a welcome change. As I passed by the clothing store near the food court, a man suddenly approached me. He was in his mid-30s, dressed in a plain gray t-shirt and jeans. At first I thought he might be a store employee or someone looking to ask for directions. But instead he stopped right in front of me, blocking my path. His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment there was something in his gaze that made me pause. "Hey, do you remember me?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with an odd urgency. I was taken aback by the question, unsure of how to respond. His face seemed strangely familiar, but I couldn't place him. I must have seen him somewhere before, but I couldn't figure out where. I glanced at him for a moment longer, trying to make sense of the situation, but nothing came to mind. I told him that I didn't recognize him, and I gave a polite smile, hoping that would be the end of the conversation. But instead of stepping aside, he continued to stare at me with an intense focus. His smile was tight, almost too forced, and there was a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "No, really," he insisted. "I'm sure we've met before. It's been a while, but I know I've seen you somewhere." I shifted uncomfortably on my feet, the unease growing in my stomach. I glanced around, hoping someone might walk by and interrupt the strange encounter. But the mall was quiet, and no one seemed to notice us. I began to feel like I was trapped in this interaction, unsure of how to extricate myself. "I'm sorry," I said again, trying to remain polite, "but I don't think we've met." The man didn't seem to accept my answer. His expression didn't change, but his voice took on a more insistent tone. "Come on, think harder," he said. "You must remember me. We had a really good conversation last time we met." His words were almost too casual, as if he expected me to immediately recognize him. The more he spoke, the more my discomfort grew. There was something unsettling about his persistence. I forced myself to take a step back, hoping to put some physical distance between us. "I really don't remember," I replied, my voice growing more hesitant. I could feel my pulse quickening, and I was starting to wonder if I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a harmless misunderstanding, but the man's demeanor wasn't easing my nerves. In fact, it was doing the opposite. He didn't seem fazed by my lack of recognition at all. His smile widened just a little, though it still didn't seem entirely genuine. "You don't have to be shy," he said. "I won't bite. Just think. We've met before, right?" He reached out, placing a hand on the sleeve of my jacket, as though to steady me or perhaps to keep me from leaving. I flinched at the unexpected touch, pulling away instinctively. That was when I noticed something even stranger. The more I looked at him, the more his face seemed to blur, as though it was changing, subtly shifting with every second. It was hard to focus on his features for too long without feeling dizzy. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my head, but when I looked at him again, he still looked like someone I should know, but I couldn't remember him at all. It was as if my mind was refusing to recognize him, but I couldn't figure out why. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and his lips pressed together in a thin line. His expression darkened for a moment, and I could feel the shift in his energy. He seemed to notice my growing unease, and for the first time I saw a flicker of frustration pass across his face. "You're really not going to remember, are you?" he muttered, almost to himself. I stepped back once more, my instincts telling me that something was very wrong. I wasn't sure if I was dealing with a person who was just eccentric, or if there was something more to this encounter. His persistence was becoming increasingly unsettling. "I'm sorry, but I really need to go," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Please excuse me." For a moment, I thought he might let me go, but instead, he reached out again, this time grabbing my arm with a grip that was firmer than I expected. His fingers were cold, and the touch felt invasive, as though he was trying to anchor me to the spot. "Wait," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "Just one more time. Think, you know me." I pulled my arm away from his grasp, my heart pounding in my chest. "Please leave me alone," I said, my voice a little louder this time. This time I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned quickly and walked away, my steps quickening as I made my way toward the nearest exit. I could feel his gaze following me, burning into the back of my head. I didn't dare look back, not even once. As I stepped out into the fresh air of the mall's parking lot, I finally allowed myself to take a deep breath. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. I was still unsure of what had occurred, whether I had been dealing with a man who was genuinely confused or someone with a more sinister agenda. But I knew one thing for sure: I would not be going back to that mall anytime soon. The encounter lingered in my mind long after I got home. I kept thinking about his words, his touch, and the strange feeling that I had been caught in some kind of game I didn't understand. No matter how much I tried to convince myself it was just a weird interaction, I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had followed me out of the mall. I knew that I would never forget the way he looked at me, the way his persistence had felt less like a question and more like an accusation. Story 24. The evening had settled in quietly at the remote campsite, nestled deep in the woods. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a welcome relief from the cool mountain air. I was alone for the weekend, enjoying the solitude of nature, a much-needed escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a bird, leaving me with a sense of peace and isolation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I set up my tent and began to prepare a simple dinner over the campfire. The firelight danced on the trees around me, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the unknown. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world, a sensation I had come to appreciate. After finishing my meal, I sat back and stared at the stars, the vast expanse of the night sky reminding me of how small I truly was. The tranquility of the evening was suddenly broken by a faint sound, something I couldn't quite place. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was voices, soft murmurs as though someone was talking in the distance. I sat up straighter, trying to make sense of it. The voices seemed to come from beyond the trees, but there was no one in sight. The campsite was isolated, miles away from the nearest road or trail, and I was certain no one else had passed through. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling of unease that crept up my spine. It could have been an animal, or perhaps my mind playing tricks on me in the silence of the woods. I had been alone for a few days now, and maybe the isolation was starting to get to me. But the voices were still there, faint but unmistakable, as if someone or something was just beyond the reach of my campfire's light. I decided to investigate, though I couldn't shake the growing sense of discomfort that had settled in my chest. I stood up and made my way to the edge of the campsite, peering into the darkness beyond. The voices faded as I moved, but the silence that followed felt even more unnerving. I checked the perimeter of the campsite, making sure there was no sign of anyone else, no footsteps in the dirt, no disturbance in the brush. The air was still, the trees swaying only slightly in the breeze. There was no evidence of anyone nearby. Still, the voices lingered in my mind, a memory of something I couldn't explain. When I returned to my tent, I noticed something odd. The zipper, which I had carefully closed earlier, was now slightly ajar. I froze for a moment, staring at the small gap. It wasn't much, just enough to notice. I hadn't been inside for a while, so there was no reason for it to be open. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The tent was empty, but the sense that something had been inside was overwhelming. I checked the rest of the campsite again, but still, there was no sign of anyone. I knelt down and looked around the tent, hoping to find some clue as to what had happened. The ground was soft, and I noticed something strange: footprints, small, faint impressions in the dirt, leading from the entrance of the tent to the trees and back again. I blinked, not quite believing what I was seeing. The footprints were fresh, but they didn't make sense. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, as if someone had walked right up to my tent and then turned back, leaving no trace of their arrival. I followed the footprints, trying to make sense of them. They led in a circular pattern around my tent, as though someone had walked around it several times before retreating into the woods. There were no other signs of disturbance, no brush moved or broken branches, just these strange, isolated footprints. I crouched down to get a better look, trying to determine what kind of shoes they might have been made by, but the prints were too faint to be sure. Whoever had left them hadn't been wearing anything heavy or solid. The more I examined the ground, the more unsettling the situation became. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what was happening. I was certain I had locked the tent when I left earlier, so how could the zipper have been left open? And who or what had made these footprints? There was no one around for miles, and the thought of someone stranger or otherwise being so close to my tent without me noticing made my stomach churn. I quickly stood up and backed away, my eyes darting to the shadows in the trees, expecting to see someone lurking just beyond the firelight. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? Was I in danger? The campfire's flickering glow felt like the only thing keeping the darkness at bay, and the idea of packing up and heading into the unknown woods felt more dangerous than staying put. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the silence around me wasn't as safe as it seemed. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I decided to wait it out, hoping that whatever had happened was just a freak occurrence. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, keeping my eyes on the trees, listening for any sign of movement. The voices never returned, and the silence stretched on, suffocating in its stillness. The fire burned low, and I eventually crawled into my tent, locking the zipper tightly this time. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept returning to the strange footprints, the eerie voices, and the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone in the woods. By morning, the air was still, and the campsite was as quiet as it had been the night before. The footprints were still there, leading in and out of my tent, but there was no trace of anyone nearby. I packed up my things quickly, eager to leave the unsettling place behind. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees, that the woods were hiding something I would never understand. Story 25. I had been working late at the office, the clock ticking past midnight. The building was silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional tapping of keys on my keyboard. Most of my coworkers had left hours ago, and I had stayed behind to finish up some last-minute tasks. The only sounds in the building now were my own movements as I gathered my things, ready to call it a night. As I walked toward the exit, a chill ran down my spine. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The halls were empty, the usual noise of phone calls and chatter replaced by an eerie quiet. I paused for a moment, listening. It was then that I heard a faint sound, almost like a whisper. It seemed to come from the direction of the break room, but I couldn't make out any words. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the building settling or the sound of an air vent kicking on. Still, something felt off. I continued toward the exit, my footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. As I passed the break room, I glanced inside, but it was empty. I exhaled in relief, chalking up the feeling to my overactive imagination. Yet, as I reached the door to the stairwell, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of the hallway, a figure moved in the shadows. I froze, my heart racing as I stared at the outline of the person. They were barely visible, but I could make out the shape of their body, hunched slightly, as though they were trying to remain hidden. The faint light from the exit sign illuminated their figure, but their face was obscured by darkness. I couldn't see any features, but I could feel their gaze on me. The air in the hallway seemed to grow thicker, the quiet pressing in on me like a weight. I took a cautious step back, trying to make out more details, but the figure remained still, their eyes fixed on me. The way they stared made my skin crawl, as if they knew something I didn't. I felt a shiver run through me, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it. But the figure didn't move, and that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to move. I reached for my phone in my pocket, hoping to call someone. Anyone, to make sure I wasn't alone in the building. But my hands were shaking, and I couldn't bring myself to look away from the figure. I felt trapped, as if something in the air was holding me in place. The silence between us seemed to stretch for eternity. The figure didn't speak, didn't move, just continued to stare. It was as though time had stopped, and all I could do was wait. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I run? Should I confront them? But my feet wouldn't move, and my heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure took a slow step forward. My body tensed, and I instinctively took a step back. The movement was deliberate, measured, as if they were closing in on me. My pulse quickened, and I felt the cold sweat trickle down my back. I was alone, late at night, in a dark building with someone or something that I couldn't see clearly. The figure stepped into the dim light from the exit sign, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of their face. It was pale, almost sickly looking, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into mine. There was something unnatural about the way they stared, like they weren't really seeing me, but rather something beyond me. I couldn't look away, my body frozen in place, every instinct telling me to run. But before I could react, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from view. I blinked, unsure if what I had seen was real. My heart was still racing, and my hands were trembling as I reached for the door handle to the stairwell. I didn't know if I could trust my own eyes anymore. But the sense of dread in my chest told me something wasn't right. I turned the handle and pushed the door open, the noise of the door creaking echoing in the silence. The stairwell was dark, and the cold air inside sent another shiver through me. I glanced over my shoulder one last time, but there was no sign of the figure. The hallway was empty, as if they had never been there at all. My breath caught in my throat, and I hurried down the stairs, eager to escape the building. Each step I took felt like a mile, the weight of the silence pressing in on me. My mind raced with questions. Who was that figure? Why had they been watching me? Was it someone from the office, or was it something more sinister? I couldn't make sense of it, and the more I thought about it, the more the fear settled in. When I finally reached the lobby, I rushed toward the exit. The doors clicked open, and I stepped into the cold night air, feeling the tension in my chest begin to ease. I glanced back at the building, the lights still flickering in the windows. The figure had vanished, but the sense of unease remained, lingering in the back of my mind. I told myself I had just been tired, that my mind had played tricks on me. But as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The darkness seemed to stretch around me, and every shadow felt like it was hiding something. I started the car and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The figure in the hallway stayed with me, haunting my thoughts as I made my way home. I didn't know if I would ever find out who or what that figure had been, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never stay late at the office again. Story 26. I had just gotten into my car after a long day at work, the familiar hum of the engine offering a sense of relief as I prepared to head home. The evening was growing darker, the streets quieter, and I couldn't wait to get to my apartment and unwind. As I sat there, adjusting the rearview mirror and gathering my thoughts, a knock on the driver's side window startled me. I looked up to see a man standing there, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the evening, but his eyes were clear and focused on me. I rolled down the window just a crack, enough to hear him but still feeling the safety of the car between us. He quickly introduced himself as if he knew I would be curious. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and rough. "I've got tire and I was wondering if you could help me change it." He gestured toward his car parked just a few feet away, a beat-up sedan with a visibly deflated tire. His request seemed simple enough, and at first I didn't think much of it. I hesitated for a moment, my gut telling me something wasn't quite right, but I tried to brush it off. It was late, and I was exhausted. I wasn't a mechanic, and I didn't want to risk getting involved in a situation that could take up more of my time than I was willing to give. "Sorry," I said, forcing a polite smile. "I'm not much help with car problems. Maybe you can call a tow truck or roadside assistance." His demeanor shifted almost immediately. The friendly, pleading look in his eyes vanished, replaced by something more intense, more calculating. He stood there for a moment, staring at me through the window, and I felt an odd tension build in the air between us. I could hear the sound of traffic in the distance, but it seemed muffled, as if the world around us had slowed down. His eyes narrowed, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of frustration cross his face. "You sure you can't help?" he asked again, his voice now tinged with something darker, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "It's just a flat tire. Shouldn't take more than a few minutes." He leaned a little closer to the window, and I instinctively pushed the button to roll it back up just a fraction. The gap between us seemed too small now, too close for comfort. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm really sorry, but I can't. I've got somewhere to be." I didn't know why I felt the need to explain myself so much, but it seemed to be the right thing to do. I was trying to stay calm, to avoid making this interaction any more uncomfortable than it already was. But the man didn't back off. Instead, his gaze seemed to harden, and his posture stiffened. His hand moved slightly toward the door, as though he was preparing to reach for the handle. "You sure?" he repeated, his tone more insistent now, a hint of something almost demanding in his voice. "I really need some help here. I can't get this tire off on my own. Just a little bit of help, that's all." I felt a knot form in my stomach. The request was the same, but the way he was saying it made me feel uneasy, as if he expected me to help him regardless of what I wanted. I quickly glanced around, but the street was mostly empty, and the few cars that passed by didn't seem to notice us. My mind raced as I tried to figure out how to end this conversation without escalating things. "Listen," I said, trying to remain calm but firm. "I can't help you. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to find someone else." I started to reach for the gear shift, my heart pounding as I prepared to drive away. The man's eyes flickered with something like irritation, and for a moment I thought he might say something else. But instead, he took a step back, just enough for me to feel like I had some space again. He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was sizing me up, as if weighing his options. I couldn't understand why this man was so persistent. His behavior felt strange, off, like he wasn't just asking for help anymore. I wanted to get out of there, but I was also afraid of making him angry. I slowly started to roll up the window, but before I could close it completely, he leaned forward, pressing his hand against the glass with a surprising force. "You don't have to be scared," he said, his voice now a low, almost mocking tone. "I just need some help. I'm not going to hurt you." The words sent a chill down my spine. Something about the way he said them made it clear that he wasn't reassuring me, he was trying to manipulate me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get away from this man before things escalated any further. I slammed the button on the window, and it rolled up quickly, cutting off any further conversation. I glanced in the rearview mirror to see him standing there, still watching me, his expression unreadable. I didn't waste any more time. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, my tires screeching as I pulled away from the curb. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, and I kept my eyes on the road ahead, barely able to shake the image of his cold, narrowed eyes. For the rest of the drive home, my mind raced. I couldn't understand why he had acted that way, why he had been so persistent, even aggressive. It was as if he had expected me to help him, no matter what I said. I didn't know what he wanted or why he had approached me. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't about to stop for anyone again late at night, no matter how innocent their request seemed. Story 27. I had just finished a long day at work and decided to treat myself to dinner at a local restaurant I'd been wanting to try. It was a cozy place with dim lighting, soft music playing in the background, and a quiet atmosphere that made it perfect for unwinding. I sat at a corner table, enjoying the warm, inviting ambience, and ordered my favorite dish. As I dug into my meal, I noticed a couple sitting at a nearby table, seemingly engrossed in their own conversation. At first, I didn't think much of it. People glance around when they're out, and it wasn't unusual for someone to look around the room. But as I took another bite of my food, I felt the weight of their gaze on me. The couple wasn't just glancing my way, they were staring. The woman's eyes were fixed on me, and her gaze lingered for far longer than I was comfortable with. I tried to brush it off, focusing on my food and the soft clinking of cutlery around the room. But the longer I stayed in that moment, the more I became aware of how intense their stares were. It wasn't just curiosity or a passing glance. There was something unsettling about the way they watched me. The man, too, was staring now, his eyes locked onto mine with an unnerving intensity. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, feeling the heat of their gaze as if it were physically pressing against me. I tried to look away, but every time I glanced up, their eyes were still on me, unblinking. It wasn't like the usual polite looks you get from strangers. It felt more like they were studying me, examining me. My unease grew with each passing second, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were observing me in a way that was far too deliberate. My stomach churned, and I began to feel a tightness in my chest. I thought about calling the waiter over to ask for a different table, but I didn't want to make a scene. Instead, I forced myself to focus on my food, trying to pretend that everything was normal. But the longer I tried to ignore them, the more I felt like they were dissecting my every move. It was as if I were under a microscope, and they were studying my every gesture, every reaction. The woman leaned slightly toward the man, whispering something in his ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the way his eyes shifted from her to me, then back to her. They exchanged a glance that sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I could tell they were talking about me. It felt like they were making plans, or worse, like they were deciding something about me, though I couldn't imagine what. I quickly turned my attention back to my plate, trying to block them out. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me, their eyes following my every move. It was becoming difficult to focus on anything else, and the more I thought about it, the more my heart raced. I could feel the tension in the air, like something was about to happen, but I couldn't figure out what. The man suddenly stood up, and for a moment, I thought he might be coming over to speak to me. My heart skipped a beat, but instead of approaching me, he walked toward the restroom. I let out a quiet breath of relief, though the unsettling feeling remained. But as soon as he was gone, the woman's stare intensified, her eyes now fixed on me with a cold, calculating expression. It was as if she were waiting for something, and I had no idea what it was. I began to feel trapped, as though there was no way out of this situation. I wanted to leave, to escape the weight of their gaze, but I didn't want to make a scene. I looked around the room, trying to find some comfort in the other diners, but no one seemed to notice what was happening. It felt like I was in some sort of twisted experiment, where I was the subject and everyone else was either oblivious or indifferent. The man returned from the restroom, and once again, their eyes locked onto mine. This time, they didn't look away. The woman leaned over and whispered something to him, and he nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. The atmosphere around me grew thick with tension, and I felt a cold sweat begin to form on my brow. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to do something, but I had no idea what. I decided it was time to leave. I pushed my chair back, standing up quickly, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of the couple's faces. Their expressions had shifted from curiosity to something darker, something more calculating. It was as though they were disappointed I was leaving, as if they were expecting something more from me. I didn't know what that something was, but I could feel the weight of their gaze even as I walked toward the exit. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I couldn't understand what had just happened. The couple had seemed so ordinary at first, but their strange, unsettling behavior had turned what should have been a simple dinner into something that felt deeply uncomfortable. I had no idea who they were or why they had been staring at me like that. But the feeling of being studied, of being watched, stayed with me long after I left the restaurant. I told myself it was probably nothing, just a coincidence, a strange interaction with a couple of odd strangers. But deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something about the way they watched me that I couldn't forget, something that left a lingering sense of unease that I couldn't shake. Story 28. It was a regular Tuesday evening when I decided to clean out some old boxes in the attic. I was organizing things from years past, old photo albums, mementos from vacations, and assorted keepsakes. As I sifted through the clutter, I felt a sense of nostalgia mixed with the satisfaction of clearing out the old to make room for the new. After several hours, I took a break and headed to the bathroom for a shower. It had been a long day, and a hot, relaxing shower seemed like the perfect way to unwind. I made my way to the bathroom, not thinking anything of it. The door was closed. The room was quiet, just the way I liked it. As I turned on the shower and adjusted the water temperature, my eye caught something unusual. Just above the shower head, partially hidden by the shower curtain, was a small black object. It seemed out of place, an anomaly in the otherwise familiar surroundings of my bathroom. My heart skipped a beat as I took a closer look. With shaking hands, I reached for the object. It was a tiny camera, well hidden but unmistakably a surveillance device. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what it was. The camera was angled perfectly to capture everything in the shower. The invasion of privacy was immediate and profound. My mind raced with thoughts of how long it might have been there, who had put it there, and why. I grabbed the camera and turned off the shower, dripping wet and shivering from both the cold water and the shock of my discovery. I wrapped a towel around myself and stared at the camera in disbelief. The weight of the violation settled heavily on my shoulders. My first instinct was to call the police. I was terrified, feeling exposed and vulnerable in my own home. I took the camera and any potential evidence to the living room, ensuring that I wasn't touching anything else that might have been tampered with. I dialed the police, my voice trembling as I reported the incident. The police arrived quickly, taking the camera and examining the bathroom for any other signs of tampering. They took detailed notes, dusted for fingerprints, and checked for any other potential surveillance devices. The officer in charge reassured me that they would investigate the matter thoroughly and would do everything possible to find out who was responsible. While the police conducted their investigation, I was left alone with my thoughts, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the invasion. The idea that someone had been watching me in such a private space was deeply unsettling. I found it difficult to focus on anything else, my mind plagued by images of the hidden camera and the questions surrounding it. I decided to conduct my own search of the house, inspecting every corner and crevice for any additional hidden devices. I found nothing else, but the sense of being watched lingered. I was hyper-vigilant, constantly checking the security system and scanning my surroundings for any signs of intrusion. The police continued their investigation, but progress was slow. They examined the camera for any clues that might lead them to the perpetrator. They interviewed neighbors and checked for any suspicious activity in the area. Despite their efforts, no immediate leads emerged. As the days went by, I struggled to regain a sense of normalcy. The violation of my privacy had left me feeling exposed and anxious. I avoided the bathroom as much as possible, the thought of what might have been captured on that camera haunting me. The police advised me to increase my home security and install additional surveillance cameras around the house. I followed their recommendations, upgrading the security system and adding cameras to monitor all entry points. The measures provided a sense of reassurance, but the emotional impact of the hidden camera continued to weigh heavily on me. One evening, as I was reviewing the footage from the new security cameras, I noticed something unusual. There was a brief, unexplained gap in the footage from the time when the hidden camera had been discovered. It was as though someone had been able to tamper with the footage or disable the system briefly. I reported the anomaly to the police, who took it as another sign of potential tampering. They expanded their investigation, examining the possibility that the perpetrator had a deeper knowledge of surveillance systems and could manipulate them remotely. As weeks passed, the investigation seemed to stall. The police had been able to identify the camera's make and model, but had found no clear leads on who had purchased it or how it had been installed. The sense of frustration and helplessness grew as the case remained unresolved. Despite the lack of progress, I refused to let the incident define my life. I focused on reinforcing my home's security and sought support from friends and family. The experience had taught me the importance of vigilance and self-care, and I worked to reclaim a sense of normalcy in my daily routine. Eventually, the police did make an arrest, though it was a long and arduous process. The suspect was a former employee of a home security company, someone who had the technical expertise to bypass and tamper with systems. They were charged with invasion of privacy and other related offenses. The arrest brought a sense of closure, but the emotional scars remained. The experience had left a lasting impact on my sense of security and trust. I continued to be cautious and proactive about my home's safety, always aware of the potential risks that existed even within the confines of my own home. The discovery of the hidden camera had been a profound violation, but it also reinforced my resolve to protect my privacy and well-being. The experience underscored the importance of remaining vigilant and the need to address both physical and emotional security with equal care and attention. Story 29. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in the dimly lit living room as I lazily flipped through a stack of mail. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening, or so I thought, until my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic tucked between the cushions of the couch. Curiosity piqued, I withdrew my hand to find a small, sleek device nestled among the fabric folds, a hidden camera. Confusion and disbelief gripped me as I stared at the innocuous-looking gadget. Questions raced through my mind. How long had it been there? Who could have placed it? And the most unsettling thought of all, what had it captured? With trembling hands, I carefully examined the camera. It was meticulously disguised as a nondescript button, its lens barely visible to the naked eye. A surge of paranoia coursed through me as I wondered how many intimate moments it had silently recorded, moments never meant for anyone's eyes but mine. Heart pounding, I plugged the device into my laptop. The screen flickered to life, revealing a series of time-stamped video files. My hands shook as I clicked on the first one, steeling myself for what I might see. The footage began innocuously, a glimpse of my living room, the familiar furniture arranged just as I had left it that morning. Relief washed over me momentarily, until the perspective shifted. The camera's focus honed in on me, unaware, vulnerable, going about my daily routines. Scenes unfolded before my eyes, snippets of my life captured without consent. Mornings spent sipping coffee, evenings winding down with a book, even private phone calls, all laid bare for some unseen voyeur. The violation was palpable, a sickening feeling gnawing at the pit of my stomach. As the minutes stretched into hours, dread settled like a heavy shroud. The footage was meticulously compiled, suggesting a calculated effort to invade my privacy. Anger surged within me, but so did fear of the unknown motives of whoever had planted the camera, fear of the invasion of my most intimate moments, fear that my sanctuary had been compromised. I scrolled through file after file, each one revealing more of my life exposed to a faceless perpetrator. The realization sank in that this was not a random act. Someone had deliberately targeted me, watching and waiting in the shadows of my own home. Seeking solace and guidance, I turned to the authorities. The police arrived promptly, their expressions grave as I presented the damning evidence. They assured me they would investigate, but warned that catching the culprit could be challenging without concrete leads. Days turned into weeks as I grappled with the aftermath of the discovery. Paranoia clung to me like a shadow, haunting every corner of my once comfortable home. Every unfamiliar sound sent me spiraling into anxiety. Every glance from a passerby felt like a suspicious stare. Sleep became elusive, plagued by nightmares of unseen eyes watching my every move. I became hyper-vigilant, scouring every room for signs of intrusion, double-checking locks and curtains obsessively. Trust, once freely given, now felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. The support of friends and family offered little comfort against the weight of violation. Some offered practical advice on enhancing security measures, while others urged me to seek therapy to cope with the emotional toll. Their concern was genuine, but the sense of violation lingered, a wound that refused to heal. Months passed with no resolution from the investigation. The initial fervor of the authorities had waned, leaving me with a sense of helplessness. I was trapped in a limbo of uncertainty, haunted by the knowledge that somewhere out there, someone held the power to shatter my privacy at will. In moments of despair, I found solace in small victories. I immersed myself in learning about cybersecurity, fortifying my digital defenses against potential breaches. I sought empowerment through knowledge, determined to reclaim a semblance of control over my life. Time dulled the raw edges of fear, but the scars remained a reminder of the fragility of privacy in an increasingly interconnected world. The hidden camera, once a symbol of violation, became a catalyst for advocacy. I shared my story, urging others to remain vigilant and protect their privacy rights. Today I navigate life with a newfound awareness of the shadows that lurk in the periphery. The hidden camera may have shattered my sense of security, but it also ignited a flame of resilience. I am vigilant, I am cautious, but above all, I am determined not to let fear dictate the boundaries of my existence. Story 30. The night was unseasonably warm for late October, and I had left the windows open to let in a breeze that was supposed to bring some relief from the lingering summer heat. I was nestled comfortably in my living room, curled up with a book, when I first heard a soft, shuffling noise coming from the basement. It was strange because the basement had been quiet for months. I used it mostly for storage, and aside from occasional trips down to retrieve holiday decorations or seasonal clothing, it was an area I rarely frequented. The sound was faint but persistent, like someone dragging something across the concrete floor. My initial thought was that it could be a small animal, perhaps a raccoon or a stray cat that had found its way in. But as the noise continued, I began to feel uneasy. The creeping sensation of being watched started to settle in, and my curiosity soon turned to concern. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the noise grew louder, more deliberate. I decided to investigate, grabbing a flashlight from a drawer and making my way to the basement door. The old wooden steps creaked under my weight as I descended into the dimly lit space. The basement was illuminated only by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Its feeble light cast long, unsettling shadows against the walls. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed a few items had been moved around. A box that had been neatly stacked was now tipped over, its contents strewn across the floor. The noise seemed to have stopped, leaving an eerie silence that was even more unnerving. I took a cautious step forward, scanning the room with my flashlight. Suddenly, I heard a distinct thud coming from the far corner of the basement. My flashlight beam wavered, and I nearly dropped it in surprise. I braced myself, mentally preparing for whatever was in the basement with me. I edged closer, my heart pounding in my chest, until I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of the basement, partially obscured by old furniture and clutter, was a makeshift hideout. A small, dark space had been carved out behind a stack of boxes and an old wardrobe. Inside the hideout, I could see a few personal items that did not belong to me: clothing, a blanket, and a small, dirty pillow. It was clear that someone had been living here. I was frozen in shock and fear. The realization that someone had been using my basement as a hideout without my knowledge was terrifying. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what had happened. Who could have been down here, and for how long? I turned quickly and started to ascend the stairs, deciding that the best course of action was to get out of the house and call the police. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps following me. My heart nearly stopped as I realized someone was still down there. I bolted through the kitchen, grabbing my phone from the counter and rushing outside to the front yard. I dialed 911 and reported the situation, explaining that I had heard noises from my basement and discovered a hideout that did not belong to me. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way and advised me to stay outside and keep a safe distance from the house. Within minutes, the police arrived and began their investigation. They cautiously entered the house and made their way to the basement. I watched anxiously from the front yard, feeling both relieved and apprehensive. The officers emerged after a short while, informing me that they had searched the basement and found signs of recent occupation. However, there was no one in the basement at the time of their search. The officers took statements and examined the area, noting the hidden space and the personal items. They explained that it was possible the intruder had left shortly before I discovered the hideout. They also advised me to be vigilant and to have my home checked for any additional signs of tampering or security breaches. The thought of someone having been in my home, even temporarily, was deeply unsettling. I felt violated and anxious, constantly looking over my shoulder and locking every door and window with an added sense of urgency. The police recommended that I improve my home security to prevent future incidents. They also suggested installing security cameras and ensuring all entry points were secure. In the following days, I took their advice to heart. I hired a security company to upgrade my home's security system, adding cameras and motion sensors to cover all possible entry points. I also checked the entire house for any additional signs of tampering, making sure that my home was as secure as possible. The experience left me with a heightened sense of awareness and unease. I struggled to shake off the feeling that someone had been lurking in the shadows of my home, using it as a temporary refuge. It was a disturbing reminder of how vulnerable one can be, even in the supposed safety of their own space. The investigation did not lead to the apprehension of the intruder, and I never learned who had been using my basement or why. The case remained unresolved, but the lessons learned from the incident shaped my approach to home security and personal safety. The sense of security I once took for granted was replaced by a cautious vigilance. I became more aware of the need to protect my personal space and to be proactive in safeguarding my home. Despite the unsettling experience, I worked to reclaim my sense of safety and normalcy, knowing that I had taken the necessary steps to prevent future breaches. The memory of that night remained a stark reminder of the fragility of security and the importance of remaining vigilant in an unpredictable world.